good evening, or perhaps not so good, depending on how easily you scare. The night holds a unique kind of quiet, doesn't it? A stillness where shadows lengthen and ordinary sounds take on sinister meanings. Tonight, we're leaning into that darkness. We're venturing into experiences that happen under the cloak of night, moments of fear, unexplained events, and encounters that lingered long after the sun came up. Get ready, because what you're about to see is a collection titled Scary True Dark Night Horror Stories. These aren't just campfire tales, they're claimed experiences rooted in the chilling reality of a dark night. So, lock your doors, check under the bed, and let's begin. My name's Ethan, and I used to think late-night drives were peaceful. There was a unique kind of solace I found in the ribbon of asphalt unwinding before me, illuminated only by the twin beams of my headlights cutting through an otherwise absolute darkness. Just me, the low hum of the engine, the occasional flicker of reflective road markers, and the vast, silent expanse of the night sky overhead. It was a chance to disconnect, to let the miles melt away the day's stresses, leaving behind only the hypnotic rhythm of the road. I cherished that solitude, that feeling of being the only conscious soul awake in a sleeping world. It felt like a secret shared between me and the universe, a quiet pact sealed by the miles clicking over on the odometer. That feeling, that sense of calm isolation, was shattered last Tuesday. Utterly and irrevocably destroyed on that desolate stretch of highway out past Miller's Point. Miller's Point isn't much of a point at all, more like a vaguely referenced bend in the road miles after the last vestiges of town lights have surrendered to the rural dark. It's flanked by dense woods on one side and rolling, uncultivated fields on the other, dotted occasionally by dilapidated barns that look like skeletal remains against the night sky. Cell service is a joke out there. You're lucky if you get a single bar, flickering uncertainly before vanishing altogether. It's the kind of place where if your car breaks down, you settle in for a long, lonely wait until morning, or you start walking and hope for the best. I was heading back from visiting my aunt in the next county over. She wasn't doing well, and the visit had left me feeling heavy, contemplative. The late drive was supposed to be my decompression chamber, the familiar ritual to ease the tightness in my chest. The clock on the dash read 1:47 a.m. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine from the woods. I had the windows down just a crack, enough to let the night air circulate, carrying away the stale scent of worry and hospital disinfectant that clung to my clothes. I wasn't playing music. The silence, punctuated only by the engine and the tires on pavement, usually felt right on these drives. Tonight, though, the silence felt thicker, heavier than usual. Maybe it was just my mood, the melancholy from the visit bleeding into the atmosphere. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless. I hadn't seen another car for at least half an hour. That's when my headlights caught something. At first, it was just a shape, low to the ground by the shoulder, nestled near the tree-line where the asphalt met the overgrown weeds. My initial thought, automatic and dismissive, was deer. We get a lot of them crossing the roads out here, especially at night. You learn to be watchful, scanning the edges of your headlight beams constantly. But this shape, it wasn't quite right. It was too compact, too low. Maybe a large dog? A coyote scavenging roadkill? But it was strangely still, unnaturally so. It wasn't moving like an animal startled by headlights. It was just there. Crouched. I slowed down instinctively, my foot easing off the accelerator, my eyes straining to make sense of the silhouette against the dark backdrop of the trees. The figure was dark, blending almost perfectly with the shadows just beyond the reach of my high beams. It seemed hunched over, maybe tending to something on the ground, though I couldn't see what. As I got closer, maybe 50 yards out, the details started to resolve, and a cold spike of unease shot through me. This wasn't an animal. The proportions were wrong. It had limbs, folded in ways that seemed awkward. Too sharp, the angles too severe. It looked vaguely humanoid, but disturbingly distorted, like a broken marionette discarded by the roadside. Then, it moved. It wasn't a sudden darting away, like a spooked animal. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding. Like a time-lapse video of a plant growing, but hideously, terrifyingly wrong. The limbs extended, rising from the crouch. And they kept extending. Up and up and up. Way too far. What had seemed like a compact shape became impossibly tall, impossibly thin. It unfolded itself like a carpenter's ruler snapping open, section by section, but fluidly, organically, in a way that made my stomach churn. The limbs were long and spindly, like knotted branches stripped bare, ending in what looked disturbingly like elongated fingers that scraped the asphalt as it gained height. It must have stood at least 9, maybe 10 feet tall when it finally reached its full, horrifying stature, silhouetted starkly against the trees now, a grotesque parody of the human form. My breath caught in my throat. My hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed danger, unnatural, wrong. I should have slammed on the accelerator right then, blown past it and never looked back. But I was frozen, caught in that paralyzing grip of horrified fascination. My car was still coasting slowly forward, the distance closing. And then it turned its head. It wasn't a smooth turn. There was a sound, loud even over the idling engine, that echoed in the suffocating silence of the highway. A sickening crack-snap grind, like vertebrae snapping, like wetwood splintering violently. It was a noise that vibrated deep in my bones, visceral and nauseating. The head, which seemed small and oblong atop the impossibly long neck, rotated towards my car with that ghastly sound effect. It didn't turn like a human head, pivoting smoothly. It seemed to wrench itself around, the movement jerky and violent, defying any natural anatomy. I couldn't make out features in the glare of the headlights, just the suggestion of a pale, narrow face, maybe empty sockets reflecting the light back at me like cold, dead stars. But I felt its attention lock onto me, a sudden, intense pressure in the air, like the static before a lightning strike. It saw me. The world narrowed to just the twin beams of my headlights, the impossibly tall figure standing within them, and the horrifying sound of its neck cracking still echoing in my ears. The peace of the late-night drive was gone, replaced by a primal terror so profound it felt like icy water flooding my veins. This thing wasn't just strange, it felt ancient, fundamentally wrong, something that had slithered out of a place darkness was meant to keep hidden. And it was standing right there, on the edge of my world, having just announced its presence with the sound of breaking bone. My foot hovered over the accelerator, trembling, my mind screaming one coherent thought through the static of fear: drive. The word finally broke through the paralysis, a primal command cutting through the fog of terror. My foot, which felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy and unresponsive, finally slammed down onto the accelerator. The engine roared in protest, tires spitting gravel as they fought for purchase on the shoulder before biting into the asphalt. The car lurched forward, throwing me back against the seat. I didn't dare look directly at the figure again, couldn't bear to see what those empty sockets held, but its image was seared onto the backs of my eyelids, impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, the head wrenched around at that grotesque angle. The sound of its neck snapping echoed in the sudden violence of my acceleration, a counterpoint to the engine's scream. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The car surged forward, eating up the dark highway, putting distance between me and the spot where reality had seemingly fractured. Relief, potent and intoxicating, began to wash over me. Maybe it was just standing there. Maybe it wouldn't follow. It was a desperate hope, a flimsy shield against the chilling certainty that something so fundamentally wrong wouldn't simply let its witness drive away. Then I heard it. It wasn't the sound of footsteps, not exactly. It was something far more disturbing. A rhythmic thump-scrape, that seemed to be coming from behind the car, keeping pace. It was a heavy sound, like something massive being dragged, punctuated by the sharp scrape of. I didn't want to think what. Fingernails on asphalt? Bone? The sound was unnervingly fast, far faster than anything that size should be able to move, especially with that dragging quality. It was gaining. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. I dreaded what I might see, but the need to know, the instinct to track the threat, was stronger. The road behind me was dark, the taillights painting the asphalt red, but beyond the immediate glow, nothing. Just the receding white line of the shoulder where it had stood. Was it my imagination? Was the stress, the shock, making me hear things? The rhythmic thump-scrape continued, perfectly synchronized with my speed, mocking my hope. I pushed the accelerator harder, the needle climbing past 80, then 90. The old sedan protested, vibrating, the wind howling past the slightly open windows, but I needed more speed, more distance. The highway remained stubbornly empty, a black void stretching ahead. The woods on the side were a solid wall of impenetrable darkness, the fields a vast, empty expanse under the moonless sky. There was nowhere to turn off, nowhere to hide. Just a straight, lonely road and the horrifying sound keeping pace behind me. Thump-scrape, thump-scrape. It was closer now. Louder. I could almost feel the vibrations through the car floor. My knuckles were bone white on the steering wheel, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Sweat beaded on my forehead, stinging my eyes. I risked another glance in the rearview mirror. This time, I saw it. Not clearly, not entirely, but it was there. Just at the edge of the taillight's reach, a flicker of movement, impossibly fast. It wasn't running like a person or an animal. It moved with a horrifying, loping gait, those long, spindly legs covering an impossible amount of ground with each stride. One arm seemed to drag, or perhaps it was using it for balance or propulsion, creating that hideous scraping sound. It flowed over the asphalt like black water, a silhouette of pure dread keeping pace with a car doing nearly 100 miles per hour. Its head was still fixed towards me, that pale shape of beacon in the darkness, locked onto my vehicle. Panic clawed its way up my throat, raw and acidic. This wasn't possible. Nothing could move like that, keep up like that. It defied physics, defied reason. It was a nightmare made manifest, chasing me down a desolate highway. The sound was deafening now, the thump like a giant, irregular heartbeat, the scrape like claws tearing at the very fabric of the night. I swerved slightly as a particularly loud scrape sounded, seemingly right behind my bumper. Had it touched the car? My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I risked a look at the side mirror. For a fraction of a second, I saw one of those elongated, branch-like arms reaching, the fingers impossibly long and tipped with something dark, stretching towards the rear tire. I yanked the wheel back, the tires squealing in protest. The Miller's Point stretch of highway felt endless. Miles blurred past, marked only by the horrifying rhythm of the pursuit. The dense woods felt like they were closing in, the trees like silent, watching sentinels. Every shadow seemed to writhe with potential movement. Was it just one? Or were there more, lurking just beyond the reach of my lights, waiting? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. My mind raced, desperately searching for an escape, a solution. Cell service was non-existent. There were no turnoffs for miles. My only hope was to outrun it, to reach the edge of its territory, if such a thing existed, or to make it back towards civilization, towards lights and people, praying it wouldn't follow me there. But it showed no signs of slowing, no signs of tiring. Its pace was relentless, inhuman. The thumb scrape seemed to be embedding itself in my skull, a soundtrack to my terror. How long could the car maintain this speed? How long until something gave out? A tire, the engine, me? The creature in the mirror seemed eternal, tireless, a force of nature twisted into something malevolent. It wasn't just chasing me, it felt like it was toying with me, letting me believe escape was possible while reeling me in like a fish on a line. The emptiness of the road, once a comfort, was now the most terrifying thing imaginable. There was no one else to see this, no one to help. Just me, the roaring engine, and the relentless sound of the thing that unfolded from the darkness. And it was still getting closer. The word pulsed with the horrifying rhythm of the thump scrape that filled the cabin of the car. It wasn't just behind me anymore, it felt like it was beside me, just outside the thin metal shell, its presence a palpable pressure against the windows. I didn't dare look in the side mirrors again after the glimpse of the reaching arm. The image was burned into my mind, the unnatural length, the darkness at the tips, the predatory intent. My focus narrowed to the stretch of highway illuminated by my headlights, desperately praying for a sign of civilization, a flicker of another car's lights, anything to break this terrifying isolation. The engine whined, a high-pitched keen of mechanical stress. The temperature gauge was climbing steadily towards the red. How much longer could it take this abuse? How much longer could I take it? My nerves were frayed wires, sparking with adrenaline and sheer terror. Every creak of the car, every gust of wind, sounded like the creature making its final move. The thump scrape was a constant, maddening drumbeat against my sanity. Then, ahead, a faint glimmer. Hope surged, painful and sharp, through the fear. A light. Not headlights, but the soft, hazy glow of distant streetlights. Civilization. Town. Safety. It looked miles away still, a tiny pinprick in the overwhelming darkness, but it was there. It was a destination, an anchor in the storm of horror. Come on, I muttered, urging the protesting car onward, my voice a ragged whisper. Did the creature sense the change? Did it know its hunting ground was ending? Because the pursuit intensified. The thump scrape became faster, more frantic. A heavy thud struck the rear bumper, hard enough to make the car fishtail slightly. I fought the wheel, heart leaping into my throat. It was hitting the car now. Another thud, this time against the trunk lid. Then a sound that chilled me to the core, a low, guttural hissing or rasping sound, like air being forced through dried reeds, seemed to emanate from directly behind me. It was close enough for me to hear its breathing. Panic threatened to overwhelm me completely. I could feel tears welling, hot and useless. The lights of the town seemed agonizingly slow to approach. The creature was right there, practically touching the car, its horrifying sounds filling the night. I imagined those long, spindly fingers probing for a weakness, searching for a way in. Would it smash a window? Tear off a door? The possibilities were endless and horrifying. Another violent slam against the back of the car, followed by a screech of metal. My rearview mirror, angled slightly upwards from the impacts, suddenly filled with a distorted glimpse of something pale and narrow pressing against the rear windshield. I couldn't make out features, just the impression of immense pressure, of something trying to get in. I screamed then, a raw, involuntary sound torn from my lungs. I floored the accelerator again, ignoring the engine's tortured screams, ignoring the flashing warning lights on the dashboard. The town lights were closer now, resolving into individual street lamps lining what looked like the main road into the small town of Harmony Creek, the first sign of life after the desolate Miller's Point stretch. Maybe 50 more seconds. 40. The thumb scrape faltered slightly. Was it hesitating as the lights grew brighter? Was the edge of its domain near? The impact stopped. The horrifying breathing sound faded, replaced once again by the howl of the wind and the straining engine. I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. Utterly, completely empty, bathed in the red glow of my taillights. It was gone. As suddenly as it had appeared, it had vanished back into the darkness it came from, somewhere between the last patch of true desolation and the first tentative glow of the town lights. I didn't slow down. Not until I was well within the town limits, passing houses with porch lights on, driving under the reassuring yellow glow of street lamps. Only then did I ease my foot off the accelerator, my body trembling uncontrollably, gasping for breath like I'd surfaced from underwater. I pulled over to the side of the road, the engine ticking and groaning, smelling faintly of burning oil. I sat there for a long time, shaking, the silence of the town almost as deafening as the pursuit had been. My hands were locked onto the steering wheel, and it took conscious effort to pry them loose. They were slick with sweat. I looked back down the empty road I just traveled. Nothing. Just darkness. Had it really happened? Was it some waking nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion? Then I saw the back of the car in the rearview mirror, illuminated by a nearby street lamp. The trunk lid was deeply dented, buckled inwards in two distinct places, like something massive had slammed into it. And trailing down from the dents, etched into the dusty paintwork, were long, thin scrape marks. Deep gouges that ended in patterns disturbingly reminiscent of impossibly long fingernails dragging across the metal. It was real. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, taking the longer, more populated route, avoiding highways altogether. Sleep didn't come that night, or the next. Every creak of the owls, every shadow, sent jolts of fear through me. The sound of the thumb scrape echoes in my memory, sometimes startling me awake from a restless doze. I don't take late-night drives anymore. The peace I once found in the darkness is gone, replaced by the chilling memory of what unfolded from the roadside shadows. I sold the car. I couldn't stand looking at those dents and scratches on the trunk. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustles the trees outside my window just right, I think I hear it. A faint thump scrape on the edge of hearing. I tell myself it's just the wind. It has to be. But I never look too closely into the darkness outside my window. Because some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And some stretches of road are best left untraveled after the sun goes down. Especially the desolate highway out past Miller's Point. I'm Olivia. From the winding country road that passes by, my house probably looks like something off a postcard. It's an old farmhouse, 2 stories with white peeling paint, dark green shutters slightly askew, and a wide, welcoming porch that wraps around the front. People slow down sometimes just to look at it, nestled amongst ancient oak trees, smoke curling from the chimney on colder days. They comment on its charm, its character. They call it picturesque. They don't know the half of it. They don't have to live inside, particularly not in the room I chose as my bedroom, the one directly beneath the empty attic space. And they certainly don't have to lie awake, heart pounding, listening to the floorboards directly overhead creak between 3 a.m. and 3:03 a.m. Every single night. It didn't start immediately after I moved in 6 months ago. The first few weeks were filled with the usual symphony of an old house settling into its bones. Groans from the timber frame, the sigh of the wind through loose window fittings, the occasional skittering I attributed to mice in the walls, a problem I promptly addressed. I expected noises. It's a house well over a century old. Silence would have been more alarming. I learned to sleep through most of it, the house's nocturnal language becoming a sort of white noise. But then it began. I can't pinpoint the exact night, but it was subtle at first. A faint creak from above, barely noticeable over the whisper of the wind or the rhythmic clang of the ancient radiator. I probably dismissed it, rolled over, and fell back asleep. The next night, maybe it was a little louder, a little more distinct. Still, easily explained away, the house settling, temperature fluctuations causing the wood to contract or expand. Plausible deniability was my friend in those early days. It was about 3 weeks in that the pattern emerged, the terrifying precision that stripped away all logical explanations. I happened to glance at my bedside clock one night, the digital numerals glowing a stark red 3:01 a.m., just as the creaking started. It wasn't random, it was a slow, deliberate sound, like the hesitant tread of a single footstep, then another, pacing a small area directly over my bed. Creak, pause. Creak, pause. It wasn't frantic, not like an animal trapped or panicked. It was measured, deliberate. And then, as I watched the clock tick over to 3:03 a.m., it stopped. Abruptly. Silence slammed back into the room, heavier and more oppressive than before. The following night, I was awake before 3 a.m., a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I watched the clock. 2:58, 2:59. The silence felt charged, electric. Then, precisely as the digits flipped to 3 o'clock, it began. Creak, pause. Creak. The same slow, measured rhythm. The same location overhead. I timed it. It lasted exactly 3 minutes, fading out the instant the clock showed 3:03 a.m. Like clockwork. That phrase echoed in my mind. Clockwork implies mechanics, predictability, something manufactured or controlled. Natural sounds aren't usually that precise. Animals aren't. The owl's settling isn't. Wind doesn't adhere to a strict 3-minute schedule centered perfectly over my bed. Night after night, the ritual repeated. My sleep schedule was destroyed. I started dreading going to bed. Lying there in the dark, waiting, became a form of torture. My ears strained, picking out every other normal owl sound and amplifying it, my nerves frayed thin. The anticipation was almost worse than the sound itself. Sometimes, I try to stay awake, reading or watching something on my laptop, hoping distraction would help. But inevitably, my eyes would drift to the clock as 3 a.m. approached. And it would begin. Always. I tried sleeping with earplugs, but the vibrations seemed to travel down through the ceiling joists, a low thrum I could feel more than hear. I tried white noise machines, fans, music, nothing could completely mask that specific, localized creak directly above me. It cut through everything else. I thought about moving my bedroom. There are 2 other small bedrooms on the 2nd floor. But the thought felt like conceding. Like letting it win. Besides, this room had the best light, the nicest view over the fields. It felt like my room, the one I painstakingly painted and furnished. And a more chilling thought followed. What if moving rooms didn't matter? What if the sound wasn't tied to the attic space itself, but to me? I haven't been up to the attic. There's a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, right outside my bedroom door. I know I should. I know I need to arm myself with a flashlight, maybe a baseball bat for courage, and confront whatever is up there, be it squirrels, a structural issue, or something else. But the thought freezes me. Standing under that hatch, pulling the cord, climbing into the darkness. Every instinct screams against it. What if the creaking isn't just floorboards? What if opening the hatch invites something down? The air around the attic hatch always feels colder, heavier. Sometimes, I think I catch a whiff of something unpleasant, damp earth, decay, something vaguely metallic like old blood, but it's always fleeting, easily dismissed as imagination fueled by lack of sleep. People still comment on the house. Such a lovely place, Olivia. You're so lucky. I force a smile. It has its quirks, I usually reply, trying to keep my voice light. They don't see the dark circles under my eyes, hidden with concealer. They don't feel the bone-deep weariness that sleep deprivation grinds into you. They don't know about the nightly 3-minute performance happening in the darkness above my head. Tonight, as I lie here writing this, it's 2:47 a.m. The house is quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the sigh of the wind. But the silence feels thin, stretched taut. 13 minutes. 13 minutes until the clockwork starts again. The tread is a familiar cold hand gripping my insides. Part of me wants to scream, to run out of the house and never look back. But another, more stubborn part, the part that bought this house and loves its sunlit rooms and ancient oaks, refuses to be driven out by 3 minutes of unexplained noise. But tonight feels different. The silence seems deeper, the shadows in the corners of my room darker, more defined. Is it just my exhausted mind playing tricks? Or is the clockwork preparing for a variation in its routine? I don't know. All I can do is wait. And listen. The clock ticked over to 3 a.m. My breath hitched. And then, nothing. Silence. A silence so profound it felt louder than the creaking ever had. 3:01 a.m. Still nothing. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Was it over? Had the simple act of acknowledging it, of writing it down, somehow broken the cycle? Hope, fragile and tentative, flickered within me. 3:02 a.m. The silence held. I almost laughed, a hysterical sound bubbling in my throat. Maybe it was just the owls settling, and my sleep-deprived mind had manufactured the pattern. Maybe I was finally free. Then, at precisely 3:02 and 45 seconds, it started. But it wasn't the slow, measured creak I'd grown accustomed to. It was a scrape. A long, dragging sound, like something heavy, furniture, perhaps, being pulled across the attic floorboards directly above my head. It was louder, harsher, more violent than the creaks. It lasted only 10 seconds, ending abruptly at 3:02 and 55 seconds. Then, for the final 5 seconds until 3:03 a.m., there was a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap, 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 tap. 5 distinct taps, right over where my head lay on the pillow. Then, silence once more. Absolute, deafening silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. The scraping sound replayed in my mind, visceral and disturbing. And the tapping, that felt personal. Targeted. The clockwork hadn't broken, it had merely changed its mechanism. The 3-minute window remained, but the nature of the disturbance had escalated. It felt less like a residual haunting and more like communication. A threat. The next day, functioning on sheer adrenaline and caffeine, I decided I couldn't ignore the attic any longer. Avoidance wasn't working, the phenomenon was evolving. Standing in the hallway, staring up at the square outline of the attic hatch, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. The air still felt colder there, the faint, unpleasant smell, damp earth and something else, something vaguely metallic, stronger than before. My hand trembled as I reached for the pull cord dangling innocuously from the ceiling. I tugged. The hatch resisted for a moment, then gave way with a groan, unfolding the rickety wooden ladder downwards. It landed on the hallway floor with a dusty thud that echoed through the quiet house. A cascade of dust motes danced in the weak light filtering from the hallway window. Looking up into the square of absolute blackness that the open hatch revealed was terrifying. It was like staring into a void. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight I'd bought specifically for this purpose, its beam cutting a sharp white cone into the darkness. Taking a deep breath, I placed my foot on the bottom rung. The wood felt brittle under my weight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Only silence answered. I forced myself up another rung, then another, the flashlight beam sweeping across rough-hewn wooden beams and cobwebs thick as shrouds. The smell was much stronger up here, decay, dust, and that coppery tang. My head and shoulders cleared the opening, and I shone the light around the attic space. It was vast, much larger than I'd imagined, stretching the full length and width of the house. The floor was covered in a thick layer of gray dust, disturbed only by my own hesitant movements near the hatch. Old trunks, broken furniture draped in white sheets like ghostly figures, and discarded junk littered the space. There were no obvious signs of animals, no nests, no droppings that I could see. I swept the beam directly over the area corresponding to my bedroom ceiling. The floorboards looked old, warped in places, but intact. There was nothing heavy sitting there, nothing that could have made that scraping sound. Just dust. Thick, undisturbed dust, except for one area. Right in the center, directly above where my bed would be, was a patch of floor about 6 feet long and 2 feet wide where the dust looked different. Smoother. As if something had been dragged across it recently. My blood ran cold. And then I saw them. Embedded slightly in the dusty floorboards, almost perfectly aligned with where my pillow would be, were 5 small, dark marks. They looked like scorch marks, or perhaps deep gouges, arranged in a neat row. Tap, 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 tap. Panic seized me. I scrambled backwards, nearly losing my footing on the ladder. I didn't care about closing the hatch properly. I slammed it shut from below, the cord swinging wildly. I leaned against the hallway wall, gasping for breath. The image of those marks burned into my retinas. Rational explanations deserted me. This wasn't squirrels. This wasn't the house settling. Something had been up there. Something had deliberately scraped the floor and tapped above my head. And it had left physical evidence. My investigation yielded nothing but more fear. I spent hours online, searching local historical records, newspaper archives, anything about the farmhouse's past. It had belonged to the same family, the Alloways, for generations before the last descendant died without heirs, forcing the sale. There were mentions of farming accidents, hard winters, the usual rural life events, but nothing overtly sinister. No murders, no suspicious disappearances, no tales of madness whispered in the local lore, at least, none that were digitized. Perhaps a trip to the town's historical society would yield more, but the thought of digging deeper felt perilous now. Did I really want to know the specifics of what might be haunting my home? The days blurred into a cycle of anxiety and exhaustion. I jumped at every creak and groan the old house made, constantly glancing over my shoulder, feeling watched even in broad daylight. The charm of the farmhouse felt like a thin veneer over something deeply wrong. The picturesque facade mocked me. My friends noticed the change. "You look exhausted, Olivia," one said, concern etched on her face. "Is everything okay with the house?" "Just old house problems," I lied, forcing another smile. How could I explain? How could I tell them I believed something malevolent was living in my attic, keeping a precise 3-minute schedule of terror centered directly above my bed, and that it was now leaving physical marks? They'd think I was losing my mind. Sometimes I wondered if they'd be right. But the scraping sound, the tapping, the disturbed dust, the marks on the floorboards, those were real. I hadn't imagined them. And as night approached once more, the dread returned, heavier than ever. The clockwork hadn't just changed, it felt like it was accelerating, building towards something. What would 3 a.m. bring tonight? Another scrape? More tapping? Or something worse? The silence before the storm felt unbearable. The cracks weren't just in the old plaster walls anymore. They were widening in my sanity. I stopped trying to sleep. What was the point? Lying in bed became an exercise in pure terror, waiting for the clock to strike 3, wondering what new horror the attic held. Instead, I took to sitting in the armchair in the corner of my bedroom, wrapped in a blanket, a heavy fireplace poker resting against the arm, watching the digital clock on my nightstand with morbid fascination. I was a prisoner in my own home, held captive by a 3-minute window of the supernatural. The scraping and tapping continued for 3 more nights, always precise, always between 3 hours 2 minutes and 45 seconds and 3:03 a.m. The consistency was maddening. It felt like a deliberate taunt, a slow tightening of a noose. On the 4th night after my attic exploration, I decided I couldn't just sit and wait anymore. Fear had curdled into a strange sort of desperate anger. This was my house. As 2:55 a.m. approached, I stood up, poker gripped tightly in my hand. My heart hammered, but my resolve felt cold and hard. I walked out of my bedroom and stood directly beneath the attic hatch in the hallway. The cold spot was more pronounced than ever, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the blanket draped over my shoulders. The metallic, earthy smell hung heavy in the air. I stared up at the hatch, poker held ready. "All right," I whispered, my voice shaking slightly despite my anger. "I'm here. What do you want?" The house remained silent. The grandfather clock downstairs ticked loudly in the stillness. 2:58. 2:59. I braced myself, expecting the scraping to start above me. 3 a.m. Silence. Deep, expectant silence. 3:01 a.m. Still nothing. The tension was unbearable. My muscles screamed from holding the heavy poker aloft. 3:02 a.m. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. Had my confrontation scared it off? Was it that simple? Then, at 3 hours 2 minutes and 45 seconds, it happened. Not scraping. Not tapping. It was a thud. A heavy, sickening thud from directly above the hatch, as if something substantial had been dropped. Immediately following the thud, the attic hatch shuddered violently. Dust rained down around me. I stumbled back, poker held defensively. The hatch bulged downward slightly, the wood groaning under pressure from above. It wasn't trying to communicate anymore. It was trying to get out. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over me, extinguishing the anchor. I turned and fled, stumbling down the stairs, not stopping until I reached the front door. My hands fumbled with the locks, the poker clattering to the floor. I wrenched the door open and ran out onto the porch, into the pre-dawn chill, gasping for air. I stood there, shivering, watching the upstairs windows of my charming, picturesque farmhouse. The light in my bedroom was still on, casting a pale yellow rectangle onto the overgrown lawn. Nothing else happened. No further sounds, no movement from the attic hatch which I could just glimpse through the hallway window from my vantage point. At 3:03 a.m., as always, the perceived activity stopped. The pressure on the hatch presumably ceased. But I couldn't go back inside. Not then. I sank onto the top step of the porch, wrapping the thin blanket tighter around myself, watching the sky slowly lighten in the east. The birds began to sing their morning chorus, oblivious to the terror that had unfolded just minutes before. The world outside the farmhouse walls carried on as normal, making the events inside feel even more surreal and isolating. When the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the dew-covered grass, I finally forced myself back inside. The house felt quiet, still. The poker lay where I dropped it. Hesitantly, I looked up. The attic hatch was closed, flush with the ceiling, looking as innocuous as ever. There was a fine layer of fresh dust on the floor beneath it. Had I imagined the bulging, the groaning wood? Was the thud just the owls settling in a particularly dramatic way? No. I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. The 5 marks in the attic floor, the scraped dust, the smell, the cold spot, the terrifying pressure on the hatch, it was real. I didn't sleep in my bedroom that night, or the night after. I dragged a mattress downstairs and slept fitfully in the living room, jumping at every creak. But strangely, the 3 a.m. phenomenon didn't follow me. There was no scraping, no tapping, no thuds from the ceiling above the living room. It seemed tied specifically to the attic and the bedroom beneath it. After a week of sleeping downstairs, exhausted and paranoid, I knew I couldn't live like this. Selling the owls felt like admitting defeat, like passing the horror onto someone else, but staying felt like a slow descent into madness. I called a contractor, a grizzled old local named Jebediah who specialized in old houses. I didn't tell him about the noises. I just said I was worried about the structural integrity of the attic floor and wanted it inspected and possibly reinforced, and that I wanted the attic hatch sealed. Permanently. He came the next day, climbed the rickety ladder without hesitation. He spent a long time up there, banging and measuring. When he came down, covered in dust, he looked puzzled. "Funny thing, Olivia," he said, scratching his head. "Them floor joists directly over your bedroom, they're newer than the rest. Replaced sometime in the last 50 years, I'd reckon. Solid as a rock. But the floorboards themselves right in that spot?" He frowned. "They're warped something fierce, and there's these odd gouges. Almost looks like someone took a chisel to 'em. 5 little marks." He shrugged. "House that old, seen a lot of strange repairs. Anyway, nothing structurally wrong. We can seal that hatch up tight for you, no problem." He sealed the hatch. Screwed it shut, caulked the edges, painted over it. It was like it had never existed. That night, I moved back into my bedroom. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, dread coiling in my stomach. I watched the clock approach 3 a.m. 3 a.m. Silence. 3:01 a.m. Silence. 3:02 a.m. Silence. 3:03 a.m. Silence. Nothing happened. Not that night, nor the next, nor the one after. The clockwork was broken. The 3-minute window passed in blessed, undisturbed quiet. The cold spot in the hallway vanished. The faint, unpleasant smell faded. It's been a month now. The silence persists. I should feel relieved, vindicated, free, but I don't. Sealing the attic didn't feel like solving the problem. It felt like locking it in, containing it. The silence feels heavier now, charged with potential. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear faint sounds from within the walls now, not just the attic. A faint scratching, a low murmur, almost like breathing. Is it my imagination, hyper-alert after months of terror? Or did sealing the attic just force whatever was up there to find a new way? People still drive by and comment on how charming my old farmhouse looks. I smile and agree, but I don't sleep soundly. Because whatever was in the attic, whatever kept that precise 3-minute schedule, whatever left those marks and tried to force its way out, it's still here. I didn't get rid of it. I just trapped myself inside with it. And the clock is always ticking. My name's Noah. Not that it matters much out here, in the dead of night, surrounded by acres of rusting metal and decaying concrete. But still, it's mine. Noah. It feels solid, something to hold on to when the shadows start playing tricks on your eyes. I took the night watchman job at the abandoned Blackwood factory about 3 months ago. Why? The usual reasons, I suppose. The pay was decent, better than bouncing between temp gigs, and the main selling point was the isolation. Nobody bothers you out there, son, old Mr. Henderson, the site owner's representative, had told me during the interview, his voice raspy like sandpaper. Just keep an eye on the perimeter. Make sure no kids are trying to break in for kicks or copper thieves trying their luck. Easy money. Easy money. Yeah, that's what I thought too. A little spooky, maybe, wandering the grounds of a place that had been silent for nearly 15 years, but mostly just quiet. Blackwood Manufacturing used to churn out heavy industrial machinery parts back in its heyday. Big, greasy, noisy things. Then came the downturn, the layoffs, and finally, the shutdown. Doors chained, power cut to the main buildings, left to the mercy of time, weather, and rust. My domain was a small, prefabricated security booth near the main gate, equipped with a surprisingly comfortable chair, a desk, a law book nobody ever checked, a temperamental space heater, and a two-way radio that mostly crackled with static. Beyond the chain-link fence, topped with sagging barbed wire, lay thick woods on 3 sides and a rarely used county road on the 4th. My closest neighbor was a gas station 5 miles down that road. Isolation achieved. The first few weeks were exactly as advertised, mind-numbingly dull. I'd clock in at 10 p.m., make a slow circuit around the perimeter fence in the battered company pickup truck, its headlights cutting weak yellow beams through the oppressive darkness. The main factory building loomed like a sleeping giant, its rows of crime-coated windows like vacant eyes staring out into the night. Sometimes, moonlight would glint off a shard of broken glass high up, making it look like a momentary spark of life, but it was just a trick of the light. After the patrol, I'd settle into the booth, read dog-eared paperbacks, listen to late-night talk radio, or just stare out at the vast, silent complex, letting the hours crawl by until the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky gray. The silence was profound, broken only by the chirp of crickets, the mournful hoot of an owl in the nearby woods, or the wind whistling through gaps in the rusted corrugated metal siding of the warehouses. It was peaceful, almost meditative. But then, subtly at first, things started to feel off. It began about a month ago. Little things you dismiss. A flicker in your peripheral vision when you glance towards the main building. A sudden cold spot inside the heated booth, raising goosebumps on your arms before vanishing as quickly as it came. The feeling, that primal, prickling sensation on the back of your neck of being watched. I'd scan the fence line, the shadowy recesses between buildings, flashlight beam dancing nervously. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. Just the fatigue of the night shift playing tricks. An old, empty factory is bound to have weird drafts and settling noises. Perfectly normal. Then came the sounds. not the normal groans and creaks of an old structure. These were different. Intentional. It started with a low hum, deep and resonant, that seemed to vibrate up through the concrete floor of the booth. It lasted only a few seconds the first time, and I convinced myself it was a heavy truck passing on the distant highway, the sound carrying strangely on the night air. A week later, it happened again, louder this time, accompanied by a distinct, rhythmic clank, clank, clank. It sounded metallic, heavy, like something massive settling into place or being struck repeatedly. It seemed to emanate from the heart of the main factory building, the one that was supposed to be locked tight, devoid of power. I stepped out of the booth that night, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness towards the hulking structure. The air was still, cold. The rhythmic clanking had stopped, leaving only the ringing silence in its wake. I walked cautiously towards the main personnel door, a heavy steel affair secured with a thick chain and a padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Everything was secure. No light shone from the grimy windows. I pressed my ear against the cold metal, listening. Nothing but the faint sigh of the wind. Rationality fought against a rising tide of unease. Maybe it was pipes contracting in the cold, or loose siding flapping in a sudden gust. But the sound had been too regular, too industrial. The real turning point, the moment the comfortable solitude curdled into something cold and fearful, happened last Tuesday. It was around 2 a.m., the deadest part of the night. I was halfway through a stale sandwich, trying to stay awake, when I heard it. Not the humming or the clanking this time. It was the unmistakable groan of heavy machinery starting up. A low, grinding whine that built into a deep, powerful rumble, the kind of sound that vibrates in your chest cavity. It sounded like one of the massive presses Blackwood used to operate, shaking off years of dormancy. It went on for nearly a minute, echoing eerily across the deserted yard, before sputtering and dying with a final, metallic sigh. My blood ran cold. I dropped the sandwich, hands trembling slightly as I grabbed my heavy mag light. This wasn't wind. This wasn't settling. This was impossible. The main breakers were off. I checked them myself weeks ago in the external junction box. There was no power grid connection to that building anymore. Who could be in there? And how? I fumbled for the radio, intending to call, well, who? Henderson? The police? What would I say? I think the ghost of industry past just started a spectral assembly line. They'd think I was drunk or crazy. As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision and a growing dread, a new sound began. Softer this time. Closer. Much, much closer. It was the sound of shuffling footsteps on the gravel path leading to my booth. Slow, hesitant, uneven. Scuff, drag, scuff, drag. My heart hammered against my ribs. I flicked off the booth's interior light, plunging myself into near darkness, peering frantically through the window. The shuffling was just outside, maybe 10 feet away, obscured by the angle of the booth and the deep shadows cast by the weak security lamp near the gate. Scuff, drag. It stopped. Silence. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears hurt. Was it an animal? A fox, maybe a deer? No, the gate was wrong, too deliberate, too soft. It sounded like worn-out slippers on loose stones. Slowly, agonizingly, I moved to the door, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. Nothing moved. The shuffling didn't resume. It was as if whatever, or whoever, was out there knew I was listening, knew I was looking. After 5 minutes that felt like an eternity, the silence remained unbroken, save for the frantic thumping of my own heart. I didn't dare step outside. The rest of the night passed in a state of hypervigilance. Every creak, every rustle of leaves sent jolts of adrenaline through me. The heavy machinery didn't start again, and the shuffling footsteps didn't return. But the damage was done. The comforting silence of the Blackwood factory was gone, replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness that felt infinitely more threatening. The isolation I craved now felt like a trap. And as I sat there, watching the darkness, I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Something was awake in the heart of the abandoned factory, and it knew I was here. Sleep offered little escape after that night. When I did manage to drift off during the day, my dreams were filled with the groaning rumble of unseen machines and the maddening scuff, drag, of those phantom footsteps circling just outside my awareness. Reporting for duty the next evening felt different. The familiar drive down the county road, usually a transition into quiet boredom, was now fraught with tension. Every shadow seemed deeper, every rustle of leaves in the woods lining the road sounded like a precursor to that sound. The Blackwood factory, silhouetted against the twilight sky, no longer looked like a sleeping giant but a waiting predator. I forced myself through the routine, clock in, grab the heavy flashlight and the crackling radio, start the perimeter check in the pickup. My eyes kept darting towards the main building, scanning the rows of darkened windows, half expecting to see a face peering back. The silence felt heavier than before, charged with an unspoken threat. Back in the booth, the hours stretched into an eternity of strained listening. I jumped at every creak of the building settling, every distant nocturnal animal cry. I kept the interior light off, preferring the relative anonymity of darkness, my gaze fixed on the gravel path outside. Around 1 a.m., it started again. Not the machinery this time, but the shuffling. Scuff, drag. It was fainter than before, seeming to come from further away, near the dilapidated chain-link fence bordering the woods. My breath hitched. Was it moving away? Or just starting its approach from a different direction? I gripped the mag light until my knuckles turned white, straining to hear over the thumping in my ears. Scuff, drag. Closer now, moving parallel to the fence line, heading towards the main gate, towards me. Panic warred with a desperate need to understand. Was it human? Some vagrant trying to find shelter? But why move so strangely? Why approach the only occupied part of this vast, dead place? The sound was agonizingly slow, each step punctuated by a dragging noise, like a lame leg or something heavy being pulled along. It reached the edge of the weak light cast by the security lamp near the gate, still obscured by the angle and the deep shadows pooling beneath the skeletal frame of an old conveyor belt support. Scuff, drag. It stopped again, right at the periphery of the light, just out of clear sight. I couldn't stand it. The not knowing was worse than any confirmation. Heart pounding, I eased the booth door open a crack, the hinges emitting a low groan that sounded deafening in the stillness. Cold night air hit my face. I peered out, flashlight held low, ready to switch it on. Nothing. Absolute stillness. The shuffling sound had vanished completely, absorbed back into the oppressive silence. But this time, something felt different. The air itself seemed colder, heavier, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible scent, damp earth and something else, something metallic and vaguely unpleasant, like old pennies or dried blood. I waited, listening, for long minutes. Nothing. Finally, mustering every ounce of courage, I stepped fully out of the booth, sweeping the flashlight beam across the gravel path and towards the gate where the sound had stopped. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating loose stones, patches of weeds, and something else. Lying near the edge of the light, almost hidden in the shadow of a fence post, was a small, dark object. My hand trembled as I approached, keeping the light trained on it. It was a shoe. A child's shoe, old and worn. It looked like something from decades ago, made of cracked brown leather, with a broken lace dangling from one eyelet. It was caked in mud and what looked disturbingly like dark, dried-out leaves, as if it had been buried for a long time. There was no sign of its partner. Just the one, solitary shoe, lying forlornly on the gravel where the shuffling had ceased. Where had it come from? Had the shuffler dropped it? Or placed it there? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. This wasn't random. It felt like a message, a marker. I didn't touch it. I backed away slowly, flashlight beam never leaving the shoe until I was safely back inside the booth, the deadbolt slammed shut. My mind raced. Blackwood Manufacturing had closed 15 years ago. Had there been accidents? Stories? Henderson hadn't mentioned anything, but site owners rarely dwell on the grim parts of a property's history. Could this be related to the factory's past? A child? The shuffling gait suddenly took on a more sinister connotation. The rest of that shift was pure torture. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of a small figure. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered name I couldn't quite make out. I kept glancing at the spot by the gate, but the shoe remained undisturbed. Just before dawn, as the first gray light began to dilute the darkness, I heard it one last time, not the shuffling, but the machinery. A brief, low groan from the main building, like a sleeper stirring restlessly, followed by a single, sharp clang that echoed across the yard before silence descended once more. The following nights fell into a pattern of escalating dread. The shuffling footsteps became a near-nightly occurrence, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close, always stopping just out of sight, always leaving that profound, expectant silence in their wake. Twice more objects appeared. A rusted tin toy soldier near the warehouse doors. A single, tarnished silver button by the steps of the abandoned administration building. Always small, old things. Always placed deliberately. And the main building, it was no longer just sounds. On moonless nights, I started seeing flickers of light deep within its black windows. Not steady light, but brief, erratic flashes, like sparks from grinding metal or a faulty electrical connection, impossible in a building with no power. One night, staring intently at the third-floor windows where the main assembly line used to be, I saw it. A shadow, tall and indistinct, moving slowly past one of the grimy panes. It wasn't my imagination playing tricks. It had form, slow and deliberate movement, before it melted back into the deeper blackness within. I knew I couldn't keep doing this. The isolation wasn't a comfort anymore, it was a vulnerability. The easy money felt tainted, earned at the cost of my sanity. Reporting the lights or the sounds felt futile, but doing nothing felt like waiting for whatever was haunting this place to finally step out of the shadows. The shuffling, the small, placed objects, the groaning machinery, the fleeting lights and shadows within the dead factory, it was all converging, building towards something. As I sat in the booth last night, the radio crackling with static that almost sounded like whispers, I watched the main building, feeling its immense, dark presence weighing down on me. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but now it was mixed with something else, a grim, reluctant resolve. I had to know what was inside that building. I had to see. Tomorrow night, I decided. Tomorrow night, I find a way in. The thought itself felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. The decision, once made, settled in my gut like cold dread. Spend another night listening, waiting, jumping at shadows? Or face whatever lurked inside the concrete shell of Blackwood Manufacturing? Neither option felt particularly safe, but only one offered the possibility of answers, however terrifying they might be. Tomorrow night became tonight. I spent the daylight hours in a haze of anxiety, gathering what little equipment I thought might be useful. My heavy mag light with fresh batteries, a smaller backup flashlight, a crowbar from the pickup's toolbox, and the mostly useless radio, just in case a miracle occurred and I could actually reach someone. As dusk bled into true night, I parked the truck further down the access road than usual, hidden by a thicket of overgrown bushes, wanting to avoid its presence potentially alerting whatever was inside. Approaching the main building on foot felt like walking into the maw of some colossal beast. The silence was different now that I was committed to breaking it. It felt brittle, like thin ice over deep, dark water. The main personnel door was still chained shut, solid and impassable. I circled the building, flashlight beam playing over rust-stained walls and boarded-up loading bays. Around the back, near where the raw materials used to be delivered, I found it, a ground-floor window where the plywood covering had warped and pulled away from the frame, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The glass behind it was long gone, shattered years ago. This was it. Taking a deep breath, I wedged the crowbar into the gap and pried. The rotten wood groaned in protest but gave way with a splintering crack that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. I froze, listening. No response. Just the wind sighing through the skeletal remains of exterior ductwork. After a tense minute, I holstered the crowbar in my belt, shone the light into the dark opening, revealing nothing but deeper blackness, and awkwardly wriggled through, scraping my jacket on the rough wood. I dropped onto a floor coated in dust, debris, and the unmistakable droppings of rodents. The air inside was thick, heavy with the smell of decay, damp concrete, oil residue, and that faint, coppery tang I had smelled outside near the child's shoe. It was colder in here, a damp chill that seeped into my bones. My flashlight beam cut a solitary comb through the cavernous darkness. Towering shapes loomed on all sides, machines shrouded in dust covers that looked like burial shrouds, stacks of forgotten pallets, the ghostly outlines of conveyor belts sneaking into the gloom. My footsteps echoed unnervingly, each crunch on the debris sounding amplified in the vast space. I moved cautiously, trying to orient myself. Based on old site plans I'd glanced at in the booth, this was likely a receiving area. The main assembly line, where I'd seen the lights and the shadow, should be deeper inside and on an upper level. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the phantom noises I'd grown accustomed to hearing from the outside. It was almost more unnerving. Or it was the shuffling. Or it was the groaning machinery. As if summoned by the thought, a low sound began, vibrating through the concrete floor. Hum. It wasn't the full-throated roar I'd heard before, but a low, idling thrum, like a generator struggling to life somewhere in the building's depths. Goosebumps prickled my skin. It was real. It was here. Following the direction of the sound, I moved deeper into the factory, my flashlight beam dancing nervously across rusted gantries and silent control panels. Dust motes swirled in the beam like tiny spirits. Then came the other sound. Scoff, drag. It wasn't outside the booth anymore. It was inside the factory with me. It echoed strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once in a vast, open space. From behind a pillar? Down that dark corridor? Up on the mezzanine level? My head whipped around, flashlight beam chasing the elusive noise. Scoff, drag. It sounded closer now, maybe just around the next bank of silent machinery. I rounded the corner, heart pounding, light held high. Nothing. Just an empty stretch of floor leading towards a wide staircase, its metal steps coated in rust. But lying on the floor, directly in my path, was another object. A small, porcelain doll's head, cracked down one side, one painted blue eye staring blankly upwards. It hadn't been there moments before. The shuffling sound had stopped again. It was toying with me, leading me. Against my better judgment, I started up the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The humming sound grew louder as I ascended, joined by an intermittent clank, or like tears engaging reluctantly. Reaching the second floor landing, I swept the light across another huge space. This must have been part of the assembly area. Machines, larger and more complex than those downstairs, sat like iron dinosaurs sleeping under layers of grime. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hall, maybe 50 yards away, a faint, flickering light. Not sparks this time, but a weak, yellowish glow, like a single, underpowered bulb swaying slightly. It illuminated a small section of the wall and the hulking shape of one of the giant presses. Beneath the light, something was moving. It was hard to make out details at this distance through the dusty air. A shape, hunched over, moving with that same, awful shuffling gait. Scoff, drag. It seemed to be interacting with the base of the press, bending down, straightening up, its movements jerky and unnatural. The metallic scent was stronger here, sharp and sickening. As I watched, frozen on the landing, the figure straightened up fully and slowly, deliberately, turned its head towards me. I couldn't see a face, only a silhouette against the weak light, but I felt its attention lock onto me, a palpable wave of cold malice washing across the distance. The humming intensified, the press beside the figure letting out a deafening groan, and a heavy piston hissed and began to lower with agonizing slowness. The figure didn't react to the machine, its focus was entirely on me. Panic finally broke through my paralysis. This was wrong, all wrong. I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned to flee back down the stairs, but the shuffling sound was suddenly right behind me. Scoff. Drag. I didn't dare look back. I scrambled down the metal steps, stumbling, catching myself on the railing. Behind me, I heard a soft, guttural chuckle that didn't sound human, followed by the accelerating clang-clang-clang of the press cycling faster and faster. I burst out onto the ground floor, sprinting blindly through the darkness towards where I thought the broken window was. The humming, the clanging, the shuffling, it all seemed to be chasing me, echoing in the vast space surrounding me. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of rusted metal and deep shadow. I slammed into a stack of pallets, pain shooting up my arm, the flashlight clattering to the floor and extinguishing. Plunged into absolute darkness, the sound seemed to rush in, overwhelming me. The shuffling was close, so close I could almost feel a cold breath on my neck. Groping frantically in the dark, my hand brushed against the rough wood of the window frame. Hope surged. I scrambled towards it, finding the opening by feel. Behind me, a final, deafening crunch echoed through the factory as if the giant press had finally crushed something substantial, followed by an abrupt, shocking silence. I didn't wait. I threw myself through the opening, heedless of the scraping wood, tumbling out onto the cold, damp earth outside. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran without looking back, heart threatening to burst from my chest, the phantom sound still echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, fumbling with the keys, engine roaring to life. I peeled out onto the county road, leaving the dark silhouette of the Blackwood factory behind me. I drove until the sun came up, putting as many miles as possible between me and that place. I never went back. I quit the job the next day, giving no explanation Henderson would accept. Let them find another fool. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I think I can still hear it. A faint, distant humming. A soft scoff, drag, just outside the window. And sometimes I catch a whiff of damp earth and old metal. They say places can hold echoes of the past. I think Blackwood holds something more. Something awake. Something hungry. And it knows my name. Noah. My name's Ava. Seems simple enough, doesn't it? Just a name. But lately, saying it, even thinking it, feels like anchoring myself to a reality that's rapidly fraying at the edges. It started 3 nights ago, when I agreed to house sit for the Carters. Looking back, maybe the first warning sign was how relieved they seemed to hand over the keys. Their smiles just a little too wide, their assurances that everything would be perfectly quiet a little too insistent. But I needed the money, and honestly, the idea of a week away from the city noise, tucked away in a cabin deep in the woods, sounded like a paid vacation. A very isolated vacation, mind you. The nearest neighbor, according to Mr. Carter's cheerfully vague directions, was a fair few miles down the old logging road. Comforting. The drive itself should have been another clue. The paved road gave way to gravel, then packed dirt, and finally, just 2 rutted tracks winding deeper and deeper into an ocean of pine and shadows. The trees grew so thick overhead they blotted out the afternoon sun, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. By the time I reached the cabin, nestled in a small, overgrown clearing, I felt like I'd driven back in time, or maybe off the edge of the known world entirely. The cabin was rustic. That's the polite word. Old timbers, dark wood stained almost black with age and weather, a wide porch sagging slightly under the weight of years and dampness. Inside, it was surprisingly large but maintained that gloomy atmosphere. Heavy, dark furniture, thick rugs that swallowed sound, and windows that seemed too small for the rooms, letting in only slivers of the already fading light. Taxidermy lined some of the walls, glassy-eyed deer and a rather intimidating owl watched me unpack my meager bag of groceries and clothes. The Carters had left a list of instructions, mostly about the generator, the well pump, and locking up tight. Nothing out of the ordinary, except maybe the underlined emphasis on always keeping the pantry door shut. Weird, but I chalked it up to keeping critters out. The first day was uneventful, almost boringly so. The silence was the most striking thing. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, waiting kind of quiet. The wind rustled the pines, birds called occasionally, but underneath it all was a stillness that felt watchful. I tried reading, but the words swam. I tried calling my friend back home, but the signal bars on my phone remained stubbornly empty. No service. No Wi-Fi. Just me, the gloomy cabin, and the endless woods. I busied myself exploring the immediate surroundings, careful not to stray too far. The woods pressed close, dense and tangled, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I felt a prickle of unease, the feeling of being observed, but I shook it off as city girl paranoia. Night fell quickly, the darkness flooding the clearing like ink. I made dinner, the sounds of chopping vegetables and sizzling oil echoing strangely in the large kitchen. I double-checked the locks, just as the Carters instructed, feeling a little foolish but doing it anyway. The house groaned and creaked around me, the way old houses do. Settling, I told myself. Just settling. Then the storm hit. It wasn't forecast, or maybe I just hadn't been able to check. It rolled in fast and hard, the wind howling like a banshee through the pines, rattling the small window panes. Rain lashed against the roof and walls, a deafening roar. Thunder cracked overhead, so close and loud the whole cabin seemed to vibrate. And then, inevitably, the lights flickered once, twice, and died. Plunged into absolute darkness, save for the frantic flashes of lightning that momentarily illuminated the room in stark, terrifying detail, freezing the watching eyes of the taxidermy in monstrous glares. My heart hammered against my ribs. Okay, deep breaths. Power outages happen, especially out here. I remembered Mr. Carter mentioning emergency candles and a heavy-duty flashlight in the kitchen drawer. Fumbling in the blackness, my hands shaking, I located the drawer. The flashlight beam cut a weak yellow swathe through the oppressive dark. It felt inadequate, like a child's toy against the immensity of the night and the storm. The candles offered a flickering, dancing light that cast long, distorted shadows, making the familiar shapes of furniture seem alien and menacing. I sat on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, flashlight clutched in my hand, listening to the storm rage. The rain drummed, the wind shrieked, the thunder boomed. And beneath it all, almost lost in the cacophony, I heard it. Tap. Just a single, faint sound. I dismissed it. The wind throwing a branch against the wall? Rain hitting a particular spot? Tap. Tap. There it was again. A little clearer this time. It wasn't sharp, like a branch. It was softer. Muffled. I strained my ears, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction over the storm's fury. It seemed to come from a wall behind the sofa. Tap, tap, tap. A little faster now. Rhythmic. Not random. My skin prickled. This wasn't the storm. This wasn't the house settling. It sounded deliberate. like someone tapping gently with a fingernail. I stood up slowly, the floorboards creaking under my weight, announcing my movement into the darkness. The flashlight beam wavered as I pointed it towards the wall. Just dark wood paneling, stretching from floor to ceiling. Nothing looked out of place. Tap. 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 It was definitely coming from that wall. But it didn't sound like it was on the wall. It sounded like it was coming from inside it. From the space between the studs, behind the wood. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Pipes? Could old pipes make a tapping sound in a storm? Unlikely. Rodents? Mice or squirrels that had gotten trapped? Possible, but the sound was too consistent, too patterned. It didn't sound frantic like a trapped animal. It sounded patient. I took a hesitant step closer, the flashlight beam dancing on the wood grain. I pressed my ear against the cool, smooth surface of the paneling. The storm noise faded slightly, muffled by the wood, and the tapping became undeniable. Faint, yes, but distinct. Tap. Tap, tap. Tap. Coming from somewhere within the dark, hollow space just inches from my ear. A cold dread, sharp and penetrating, washed over me. It wasn't an animal. It felt different. Older. Slower. I snatched my ear away, stumbling back, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping continued, unhurried, persistent. It wasn't on the windows. It wasn't on the doors. It was inside the walls, right here in the room with me, separated only by a thin layer of aging wood. The storm raged outside, but the true horror, I realized with a chilling certainty, was already inside. And it was letting me know it was there. How long I stood there, frozen between the flickering candlelight and the oppressive darkness, I don't know. Time seemed to warp and stretch in that old cabin, measured only by the frantic beat of my own heart and the persistent, maddening tap, 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 tap from within the wall. The storm outside still raged, a symphony of natural violence, but it felt distant now, secondary to the intimate horror unfolding just inches away. My initial shock began to curdle into a deeper, colder fear. This wasn't just a sound, it felt like a presence. Something patient, something hidden, something that knew I was listening. My hand, still clutching the flashlight, trembled violently, sending the weak beam skittering across the room, over the dark furniture, the impassive faces of the taxidermy animals, the heavy, closed doors. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every corner held a potential threat. Was it just in this one wall? I strained my ears again, trying to separate the tapping from the howl of the wind and the drumming rain. Tap. Tap. It was fainter now. Or, no, not fainter. Further away. I held my breath, listening intently. Silence, except for the storm. Had it stopped? Was it just my imagination, amplified by the power outage and the isolation? A desperate hope flickered within me. Maybe it was just the house, or the wind, or... Tap, tap. There it was again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the wall behind the sofa. It sounded like it was coming from the adjacent wall, the one leading towards the kitchen. My blood ran cold. It was moving. Or whatever was making the sound was moving. Slowly, deliberately, relocating within the hidden spaces of the house. Panic seized me. I wanted to run, to fling open the front door and bolt into the storm-lashed darkness, consequences be damned. But where would I go? Miles of treacherous, muddy woods separated me from anything resembling civilization, and I had no signal, no way to call for help. Running blindly into the storm felt like trading one unknown terror for another, potentially more immediate one. I was trapped in this gloomy cabin with something. I forced myself to move, backing away from the wall, keeping the flashlight beam pointed vaguely in the direction of the sound. My legs felt like lead. I retreated towards the center of the living room, trying to put distance between myself and the source of the tapping. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting my own elongated, dancing shadow onto the walls, making me jump at my own movement. Tap. 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 Now it sounded like it was coming from near the kitchen doorway. Closer. I swung the flashlight beam towards the opening. Nothing. Just the dark maw of the next room. The sound was still muffled, still clearly inside the wall structure, but its proximity was unnerving. It was like being stalked by something invisible, its location betrayed only by that soft, insistent rhythm. What did it want? Was it trying to get out? Or was it trying to get to me? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. My mind flashed back to the Carters' overly cheerful departure, their emphasized instruction about the pantry door. Always keep the pantry door shut. Why? What was in the pantry? It was off the kitchen, wasn't it? Near where the tapping seemed to be heading. A terrible curiosity warred with my instinct for self-preservation. Should I go look? Should I investigate the pantry? The tapping seemed to pause again, as if waiting for my decision. The silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. Maybe the pantry held the key. Maybe the Carters knew about this, about the tapping, and the pantry was somehow connected. Or maybe opening that door was the worst possible thing I could do. I edged towards the kitchen, moving with agonizing slowness, my sneakers silent on the thick rug but the old floorboards occasionally groaning under my weight. Each creak felt like a betrayal, announcing my position to the unseen listener in the walls. The kitchen was even darker than the living room, the single candle I'd left on the counter doing little to push back the shadows. The flashlight beam swept across counters, cupboards, the hulking shape of the refrigerator, finally landing on a narrow wooden door tucked away in a corner. The pantry. It looked old, the wood dark and slightly warped, with a simple latch holding it closed. As I approached, a new sound joined the storm's chorus. A faint scratching. Coming from the pantry door? No, not from the door itself. From the wall next to the pantry door. And then, the tapping returned, clearer now, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap. Tap. It was right there, just on the other side of the plaster and wood, seemingly concentrated in the wall beside the pantry entrance. The scratching intensified, a dry, skittering sound like claws on old wood, or maybe something brittle being dragged. It was coming from the same area as the tapping. Were they connected? Were there two things? I stood frozen before the pantry door, the flashlight beam fixed on the wall beside it. The tapping and scratching seemed to merge, creating a disturbing, irregular rhythm that grated on my nerves. I could feel the vibrations faintly through the floor. Whatever was in there, It was active. It was close. And it seemed focused on this particular spot, right next to the door the Carters had warned me about. My hand hovered near the latch on the pantry door. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to retreat, to barricade myself in a room and wait for morning, praying the power would return. But another part of me, the part fueled by a terrifying need to understand, urged me forward. What if the source was trapped in the pantry itself, and the sound was just echoing through the wall cavity? What if opening the door would reveal something explainable? A trapped animal, maybe? A very persistent, rhythmically inclined raccoon? It sounded absurd even as I thought it, but the alternative, that something truly unnatural was moving within the very structure of the house, was almost too much to bear. The tapping suddenly stopped. The scratching ceased. Silence descended again, broken only by the rain and my own ragged breathing. It was a waiting silence. A challenging silence. As if it knew I was standing right there, hand outstretched, debating whether to cross the threshold. The air felt thick, charged with unseen energy. I looked from the pantry door to the wall beside it, the flashlight beam shaking. The decision was mine. Open the door and face whatever lay beyond, or retreat and live with the terrifying uncertainty of what lurked, tapping and scratching, just out of sight. The wood of the pantry door felt cold beneath my fingertips. My fingers tightened on the cold metal latch of the pantry door. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, threatening to snap at any moment. Every rational thought screamed retreat, barricade, survive. But the silence itself was a goad. The stillness after the frantic tapping and scratching felt like a held breath, an anticipation. Whatever was in the walls, whatever the Carters were so insistent on keeping shut away, it knew I was there. It was waiting. And the not knowing, the imagining, felt somehow worse than whatever reality lay beyond the warped wood. With a surge of adrenaline overriding my fear, my thumb flicked the latch upward. It clicked loudly in the unnatural quiet, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. For a moment, nothing happened. The door remained closed, a dark rectangle against the shadowed wall. Then, with agonizing slowness, it began to swing inward, dragged open by its own weight or perhaps by a slight draft I hadn't noticed. It didn't creak like the floorboards. Instead, it emitted a low, groaning sigh, like something ancient and tired reluctantly revealing its secrets. A wave of air washed out from the opening, cold, damp, and carrying a thick, cloying smell. It was the smell of dust, of mildew, of something vaguely organic and unpleasant, like spoiled meat left too long in the dark, overlaid with a faint, sharp tang of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. My stomach churned. I raised the flashlight, its beam cutting through the absolute blackness within the pantry. It wasn't large, just a deep, narrow space lined with rough wooden shelves. Most were empty, coated in a thick layer of gray dust that seemed to swallow the light. A few sad-looking jars sat on a lower shelf, their contents murky and unidentifiable. Cobwebs draped the corners like macabre decorations. It looked ordinary. Disappointingly, terrifyingly ordinary. Just an old, neglected pantry. Had I imagined it all? Was the tapping just the storm, the scratching just mice, the fear just my own overactive imagination running wild in the dark, isolated cabin? Relief wore it with a lingering unease. I stepped cautiously over the threshold, shining the light around the small space. Empty sacks slumped in one corner. More dust. More cobwebs. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed capable of making the rhythmic, moving sounds I'd heard. I swept the beam upwards, towards the ceiling. And then I saw it. Scratched into the wooden planks of the ceiling, almost hidden in the deep shadows above the top shelf, were marks. Not random scratches, like an animal might make. These were deliberate. Symbols, crude and jagged, gouged deep into the wood. They looked like nothing I recognized, not letters, not numbers, just angular, unsettling shapes that seemed to writhe under the flashlight beam. Beneath them, the wood was darker, stained almost black in patches, as if something had seeped into it long ago. A chill, entirely separate from the damp air, traced its way down my spine. What were these? Who made them? And then, the smell hit me again, stronger now that I was inside the confined space. That rotten, organic scent mixed with something else, something metallic. Like cold blood. I lowered the beam, scanning the floor. It was bare wood, like the rest of the cabin, but here too, there were dark stains, concentrated near the back wall. My light lingered on the back wall itself. It was just wood planking, like the others, but something was wrong. The planks didn't look quite right. There were faint lines, almost invisible in the dim light, suggesting a seam? An outline? Tap. The sound was so close, so sharp, it made me gasp and stumble backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. It hadn't come from the walls outside. It had come from inside the pantry. From the back wall. Tap. Tap, tap. Louder now. Sharper. Like something hard rapping against the wood from the other side. The scratching started again, too, but different this time. Not the dry skittering I'd heard before, but a wet, tearing sound. Like claws digging into damp earth, or something worse. The sounds were coming directly from the stained, marked section of the back wall. The section that looked like it might not be a wall at all. Panic, cold and absolute, flooded me. This wasn't a pantry. This was something else. A hidden space. A sealed-off area. And there was something in there. Something that had been tapping, scratching, moving through the hidden spaces of the house, and had now retreated to this final, concealed chamber. The Carters hadn't wanted me to keep critters out of the pantry. They'd wanted me to keep whatever was in it from getting out. Always keep the pantry door shut. The words echoed in my mind with horrifying clarity. Tap. 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 The rapping was frantic now, insistent. The wood of the back wall seemed to bulge slightly with each impact. Splinters of wood flew inwards. The tearing sound grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural clicking noise that vibrated through the floor, through the soles of my shoes, into my very bones. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else, something contained, something furious. I scrambled backward out of the pantry, slamming the warped door shut. My fingers fumbled desperately with the latch, finally managing to click it back into place just as a heavy thud struck the inside of the door, making the wood shudder violently. I threw my weight against it, my heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest. Whatever was inside threw itself against the pantry door again and again. The wood groaned, the latch strained. Dust rained down from the door frame. The scratching sound was right there, on the other side of the thin wood, inches from my face. I could hear it splintering the inside of the door, trying to find purchase, trying to tear its way through. The horrible clicking sound intensified, seeming to fill the small kitchen. I was trapped between the raging storm outside and the contained fury within the pantry. The flashlight beam shook uncontrollably in my hand, illuminating the vibrating pantry door. How long could the old wood hold? How long could that simple latch withstand the assault? The tapping had stopped being a mere sound. It had become a physical force, a relentless battery against the last barrier. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that the barrier wasn't going to last. The true dark night horror wasn't just in the woods, or in the storm, or even in the walls. It was right here, in this kitchen, fighting its way out of the pantry, and I was the only thing standing in its way. My name's Liam. Been driving trucks cross-country for the better part of 15 years now. 18 wheels, a couple tons of steel and cargo, and miles upon miles of asphalt ribboning out ahead. That's been my life. It's a solitary existence, mostly. Just me, the rumble of the diesel engine, the crackle of the CB radio spitting out garbled chatter from ghosts miles down the road, and the endless, hypnotic white lines sliding under the cab. You get used to the loneliness, even come to prefer it sometimes. Cities are chaos, noise, people rushing nowhere fast. Out here, on the long stretches between nowhere and somewhere else, there's a kind of peace. But there's other stuff too. Late nights on deserted highways, they have a way of playing tricks on your eyes, on your mind. Especially when you're pushing hour 14, fueled by lukewarm coffee and sheer willpower. You see things. Shadows that twist into shapes they shouldn't be. Animals darting out that look wrong. Flickering lights where no light should be. Most times, it's just fatigue, your brain trying to make sense of the monotony in the dark. You learn to shake it off, focus on the road, crank up the radio. You see weird stuff, sure. Everyone who drives long haul has stories. Glare ice that looks like grasping hands, fog banks thick as cotton that swallows sounds whole, the eerie glow of distant refineries painting the clouds unnatural colors. Weird, yeah, but explainable, usually. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I saw last month. Deep in the New Mexico desert, on a particularly desolate stretch of Old Route 66. It was late. Maybe 2, 3 in the morning. I was hauling a load of machine parts from California heading towards Oklahoma City. This leg of the journey always felt the longest, the emptiest. New Mexico at night is a different kind of darkness. It's vast, swallowing. The sky is immense, littered with stars so bright they almost hurt to look at, but down on the ground, the blackness presses in from all sides, broken only by the twin beams of my headlights cutting a path through the void. The air was still, unusually so. No wind whistling around the cab mirrors, no tumbleweeds skittering across the road like skeletal dancers. Just silence, thick and heavy, broken only by the thrum of my engine. I remember feeling jumpy even before it happened. Maybe it was the coffee wearing off, or maybe it was something else. The radio had been spitting static for the last hour, not even picking up the faint whispers of distant stations I could usually snag out here. Just a low, persistent hiss, like the desert itself was breathing static electricity. I turned it off eventually, preferring the engine's familiar growl to the unnerving white noise. The silence that followed felt watchful. I crested a small rise, the road stretching out arrow straight ahead, vanishing into the horizon. And that's when I saw it. Far off, maybe half a mile down the road, right in the middle of my lane. A shape. At first, I figured it was a deer, frozen in the lights. Happens all the time. Or maybe a piece of shredded tire, a large tumbleweed, debris blown onto the road. But as I got closer, maintaining speed, the shape didn't move. Didn't resolve into anything familiar. It was upright. Tall and impossibly thin. Too tall to be a person just standing there. Too still. My foot eased off the accelerator instinctively. The air in the cab suddenly felt cold, despite the heater humming away. My eyes strained, trying to make sense of the silhouette against the black top. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't debris. It looked like a figure. A person, maybe? But who in their right mind would be standing stock still in the middle of Route 66, miles from the nearest sign of civilization, in the dead of night? Closer now. Maybe a quarter mile. The figure remained absolutely motionless. Not a twitch, not a shift in weight. Just standing there, facing my oncoming rig. My high beams washed over it, and the details started to emerge, details that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. It was humanoid, yes, but distorted. The limbs seemed too long, the torso too narrow. It wore no discernible clothing, yet its form was stark black against the illuminated road, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. It was like looking at a hole cut out of the night itself, shaped vaguely like a man stretched on a rack. I was slowing down considerably now, my mind racing. Road hazard? Drunk? Suicide attempt? But the stillness, it was unnatural. Completely, utterly passive. Like a statue carved from shadow. I honked the air horn, a deafening blast that echoed across the empty landscape. Nothing. No reaction. It just stood there, waiting. Then I saw the eyes. They weren't reflecting my headlights, not like animal eyes catching the beam and shining back. No, these seemed to glow faintly, with their own internal luminescence. A dull, reddish light, like dying embers buried deep in coal-black sockets. They weren't bright, just present. 2 pinpricks of unsettling light fixed directly on me, cutting through the glare of my own high beams. My blood ran cold. This wasn't human. This wasn't anything I understood. My foot hovered over the brake, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I was maybe 100 yards away. I could see the texture of its surface. It wasn't smooth skin, but it wasn't clothing either. It looked rough, almost like charred bark, yet fluid, as if the shadows it was made of were constantly shifting, coalescing into that rigid form. I had a choice. Slam on the brakes, potentially jackknife the rig, and be stuck there, headlights illuminating this thing. Or swerve. But swerving meant either hitting the soft shoulder and risking getting bogged down in the sand, or crossing the center line into the opposite lane, empty now, but who knew what might be coming. Or I could just keep going. Aim slightly to the side, pass it, and get the hell out of there. Fear made the decision for me. Primal, unreasoning terror. I gripped the wheel, nudged the truck slightly to the left, just enough to pass, keeping my eyes locked on the figure, on those faintly glowing embers. As I drew level, maybe only 10 feet separating my cab from the silent sentinel. Time seemed to stretch. It didn't turn its head. It didn't flinch from the roar of the engine or the rush of displaced air. It just stood there, an effigy of dread in the middle of the highway, its dull red eyes burning into the side of my vision. I swear I felt a coldness seep into the cab, a physical wave of ice that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. Then I was past it. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I risked a glance in my right side mirror. It was still there, standing exactly as it had been, dead center in the southbound lane. And as I watched, its head slowly, deliberately, turned to follow my retreating taillights. Those two faint red glows, shrinking in the distance, were fixed right on me. I stomped on the accelerator, pushing the engine, wanting nothing more than to put as much distance between me and that spot on Route 66 as possible. But looking back at the mirror, just before the road curved slightly and took it out of view, I saw something else. It wasn't standing alone anymore. On the opposite shoulder, another identical shape was stepping out of the darkness. And further down the road, barely visible, were there more? My foot was welted to the floor. The engine screamed in protest as I pushed the rig harder than I probably should have, the speedometer needle climbing steadily. The curve in the road mercifully swallowed the sight behind me, but the image was burned onto my retinas, the impossibly tall, thin figure turning its head, the faint red embers of its eyes locking onto me, and the others emerging from the oppressive darkness on the roadside. How many? 2, 3, more? My mind refused to process it, recoiling from the implication. The cab felt like an icebox, but sweat was pouring down my face, stinging my eyes. My breath came in ragged gasps. Every nerve ending was alight, screaming danger. I kept glancing compulsively at my mirrors, left, right, left again, half expecting to see one of them keeping pace alongside the truck, a loping, unnatural stride matching my 70 miles per hour. Nothing. Just the endless blacktop spooling out behind me, empty under the cold starlight. But the feeling of being watched, of being pursued, was immense. It pressed in on me just like the desert darkness had earlier, only now it had teeth. I drove like a bat out of hell for what felt like an eternity, but the dashboard clock showed only 20 minutes had passed. 20 minutes of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. My knuckles were aching from gripping the wheel so tight. My jaw hurt from clenching my teeth. The silence in the cab was deafening now, amplifying the frantic thumping of my own heart. I desperately wanted to turn the radio back on, even if it was just static, anything to break the oppressive quiet. But I couldn't bring myself to reach for the dial. It felt like admitting weakness, like letting them know they'd gotten to me. Besides, what if the static wasn't just static anymore? What if a voice came through, low and guttural, whispering my name? The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread washing over me. Route 66 stretched on, relentlessly straight again. The landscape remained unchanged, flat, featureless desert under a vast, uncaring sky. No lights, no towns, no other vehicles. It felt like I was the only moving thing in the entire universe, fleeing from something ancient and malevolent that had woken in the dead heart of the night. Was I losing my mind? Had the fatigue finally cracked me? Sleep deprivation can do strange things, conjure up hallucinations. I clung to that thought like a lifeline. A waking nightmare brought on by too many hours, too much caffeine, too much loneliness. It had to be. Because the alternative was unthinkable. That things like that existed, standing silently on desolate highways, waiting for what? But the memory felt too real, too visceral. The unnatural stillness of the first figure. The way it absorbed the light. Those eyes. The coldness that seeped into the cab. And the chilling certainty that I hadn't imagined the others stepping out of the shadows. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. My bladder was screaming for relief, and the fuel gauge was dipping lower than I liked. Normally, I could push on for another hour or two, but not tonight. I needed to stop. Needed lights, people, some semblance of normalcy to anchor myself back to reality. I scanned the horizon, praying for the telltale glow of a truck stop or a 24-hour gas station. Finally, far in the distance, a faint cluster of lights appeared, shimmering weakly in the heat haze rising from the asphalt, even in the cool night air. Hope surged through me, a desperate, fragile thing. As I got closer, it resolved into a small, run-down gas station and convenience store, the kind that clings precariously to existence on these forgotten stretches of highway. Only one flickering fluorescent light illuminated the pumps, casting long, distorted shadows. The open sign buzzed erratically, half the letters dark. It wasn't exactly reassuring, but it was something. I pulled the rig off the highway, the crunch of gravel under the tires sounding unnaturally loud. I parked near the pumps but away from the main building, leaving the engine running, the headlights cutting through the gloom. I hesitated before opening the door. Was it safe? Could they follow me here? Were they watching from the darkness just beyond the feeble ring of light? Taking a deep breath, I forced myself out of the cab. The desert air was cool but carried a strange, metallic tang I hadn't noticed before. I scanned the perimeter, eyes darting towards the deep shadows surrounding the station. Nothing moved. The only sound was the hum of the ancient fuel pumps and the buzzing of the dying sign. I walked quickly towards the convenience store, the bell above the door jangling harshly as I entered. The air inside was stale, smelling of old coffee and disinfectant. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly greenish pallor on everything. Behind the counter, a man sat hunched over a small, flickering television screen showing nothing but static. He looked ancient, his skin like worn leather stretched over bone, his eyes hidden behind thick, smudged glasses. He didn't look up when I came in, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Evening, I managed, my voice sounding hoarse. He grunted, a low, rasping sound, his gaze still fixed on the static-filled screen. I grabbed a bottle of water and a pre-packaged sandwich that looked like it had been there since the Eisenhower administration. Anything to have a reason for stopping. I went to the counter. Just this, I said, placing the items down. He slowly, deliberately, turned his head. His eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, seemed unfocused, milky. He looked through me rather than at me. He rang up the items with agonizing slowness, his bony fingers fumbling with the keys. See anything unusual out there tonight? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, failing miserably. My heart was pounding again. He paused, his hand hovering over the cash register drawer. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The static from the small TV seemed to intensify, filling the small store with its insistent hiss. Unusual, he rasped, his voice dry as dust. Depends. What you call unusual, son? Just figures. On the road. Back a ways. He stared at me for a long moment, his milky eyes unnervingly blank. A strange, faint smile touched his lips, barely visible beneath the wrinkles. Figures, he repeated softly. Tall ones? Dark ones? A chill snaked down my spine. Yeah, how did you know? The smile widened fractionally. They walk the roads sometimes. When the night's deep enough. Been walking them a long time. He finally looked directly at me, and his eyes seemed clearer for a second, holding a disturbing glint of knowing. Best not to stare too long. Best to just keep driving. He took my money, counted up the change with the same agonizing slowness, never breaking eye contact. The static from the TV seemed to pulse in rhythm with his movements. You be careful now, he said, his voice dropping back into that dry rasp. Some things out here, they don't like being seen. And they remember faces. I snatched my change in the bag, mumbled a thank you, and practically bolted out of the store, the jangling bell sounding like an alarm. Back in the relative safety of my cab, I locked the doors, my hands shaking. I didn't look back at the store. I didn't want to see if the old man was watching me from the window, his smile fixed, the static on his TV screen swirling like a captured storm. I just threw the truck into gear and pulled back onto the highway, pushing the engine hard once more, fleeing the lonely gas station and the terrifying knowledge the old man had imparted. They walk the roads. They remember faces. The vast, empty desert suddenly felt terrifyingly crowded. Leaving that gas station felt like breaking the surface after being held underwater for too long. I sucked in air, my lungs burning, but the relief was short-lived. The old man's words echoed in my head, bouncing around with the image of those glowing red eyes. They walk the roads sometimes. Best not to stare too long. They remember faces. Remember faces. My face. The face that had stared, wide-eyed with terror, as I drove past that first figure. The face reflected in the grimy window of the gas station door as I fled. Had they seen me clearly enough? Did these things even see like we do? Or did they just know? The miles dissolved under my wheels, but the tension didn't ease. If anything, it tightened its grip. Every flicker of shadow at the edge of my headlights became a potential threat. Was that a yucca plant, or was it one of them, crouched low, waiting? Was that heat shimmer on the distant asphalt, or the distortion of one of those figures moving with impossible speed? My eyes darted constantly between the road ahead and the mirrors, searching the darkness behind me, expecting to see those twin red lights reappear, closer this time. The metallic tang I'd noticed at the gas station seemed to linger in the air, even inside the cab. Or maybe I was imagining it, my senses overloaded and unreliable. I tried the radio again, desperate for a human voice, a song, anything. Still static. But now, the static didn't sound random. It seemed to have a rhythm, a cadence, almost like whispering, just below the threshold of understanding. I snapped it off again, the silence preferable to the maddening suggestion of hidden voices. Hours passed. The first hints of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, painting the horizon in bruised shades of purple and gray. Normally, sunrise is a welcome sight on a long haul, signaling the end of the lonely night watch. But this morning, the growing light offered little comfort. It only served to illuminate the vast, empty landscape more clearly, emphasizing my isolation. And it made the shadows deeper, more defined, where they lingered. Did daylight banish them? Or did they simply retreat into the places the light couldn't reach, waiting for the sun to sink again? I crossed the state line into Texas, then eventually Oklahoma. The landscape changed subtly, the desert giving way to scrubland and eventually rolling plains. Signs of civilization became more frequent: small towns, ranch houses, the occasional fellow traveler on the road. Each passing car, each lit window, felt like a small victory against the oppressive fear that had dogged me through the night. But the feeling of being watched never truly left. It was a cold weight in the pit of my stomach, a constant prickle at the back of my neck. I finally reached Oklahoma City as the sun climbed higher, the morning rush hour traffic a jarring return to normalcy. The noise, the movement, the sheer ordinariness of it all felt alien after the profound emptiness and terror of the desert night. I delivered my load at the depot, the paperwork and procedures a welcome, mindless distraction. Forklifts beeped, other drivers shouted greetings, dispatchers barked orders over radios. It was loud, chaotic, and blessedly mundane. But as I walked back to my rig, parked under the harsh fluorescent lights of the loading bay, I saw it. Scratched into the dust and grime on the passenger side door, right where I would have looked out as I passed the first figure, was a mark. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. A tall, thin line intersected near the top by two smaller horizontal marks. It looked disturbingly like a stick figure representation of the things I'd seen. Crude, almost childish, yet undeniably menacing. Below it, two small, deeper gouges in the metal, spaced like eyes. Glowing eyes. My blood turned to ice water. How? When? Had one of them reached out as I passed? Had they somehow marked the truck later, silently, while I was driving, oblivious? Or had it happened at the gas station? The old man, his slow movements, his strange smile. I frantically rubbed at the mark with my sleeve, but it wasn't just dust. The lines were etched into the paint, shallow scratches gleaming dully in the artificial light. They remember faces. And apparently, they leave reminders. I finished my route, picked up my next load, and started the long drive back west. But nothing was the same. Every stretch of empty highway at night became a source of anxiety. Every shadow seemed deeper, more menacing. I found myself avoiding the truly desolate routes, sticking to major interstates whenever possible, even if it added hours to my trip. I started sleeping with the lights on in my cab at truck stops, jumping at every unfamiliar noise. I never drove that stretch of Route 66 in New Mexico again. I couldn't. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm hundreds of miles away, I turn on the radio and find only static. And in that static, I still think I hear whispering, just on the edge of hearing. And sometimes, when I glance in my mirrors, in that split second between the dark road and the reflection of my own tired eyes, I think I see them. Tall, thin figures standing patiently by the roadside, their eyes like dying embers, waiting for me to come back. Or maybe, just waiting for the night to get deep enough again. Because they walk the roads. And they remember. My name's Isabella, but please, call me Izzy. Everyone does. If you called me Isabella, I'd probably look around for my mom or a teacher I'd somehow managed to annoy. Starting college was supposed to be this grand adventure, a shedding of the old skin, the awkward high school years, and stepping into the bright, shiny future everyone kept promising. Excitement was practically fizzing in my veins, mixed with that inevitable tremor of nerves that comes with packing up your entire life and moving hours away from everything familiar. My destination? Blackwood University, a respectable institution with sprawling green lawns, Gothic Revival architecture, and, as I was about to discover, a rather unhealthy obsession with its own history, particularly the darker chapters. My assigned dormitory was Hemlock Hall. Even the name had a slightly pretentious, vaguely ominous ring to it, like something out of a Victorian novel where someone inevitably wastes away from consumption or falls down a poorly lit staircase. It was one of the older buildings on campus, a hulking structure of dark brick and stone, partially obscured by ancient, grasping ivy that looked like skeletal fingers clutching the walls. It loomed over the newer, more cheerful-looking residence halls like a brooding grandparent silently judging the younger generation. Still, it had character, I told myself, trying to inject some positivity into my first impression. It had history. What I didn't appreciate at the time was what kind of history. Check-in was a blur of paperwork, getting my student ID, and hauling boxes up seemingly endless flights of stairs. Hemlock Hall, despite its age and grandeur, lacked elevators, or perhaps they just reserved them for moving heavier furniture, not breathless freshmen. Finally, I arrived, slightly sweaty and decidedly less enthusiastic than when I started, outside room number 413. 413. My brain, already overloaded, snagged on the number. Wasn't 13 supposed to be unlucky? And wasn't 4 considered unlucky in some Asian cultures due to its association with death? Great combo, I thought wryly, dismissing the flicker of unease as first aid jitters and exhaustion. It was just a room number. Inside, number 413 was aggressively average. Standard institutional beige cinder block walls painted over so many times you could see the layers near the trim. 2 sturdy, uninspired wooden desks and beds, 2 wardrobes, a shared sink and mirror combo near the door, and a window that overlooked a less than picturesque service alley. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else, something vaguely dusty and old, like forgotten books. My assigned roommate hadn't arrived yet, leaving me alone with my boxes and the palpable sense of emptiness. It wasn't spooky, not yet. It was just bland. Impersonal. A blank canvas waiting for cheap posters and fairy lights. The story started almost immediately. You know how colleges are, every old building, every shadowed quad, every creaky floorboard seems to come with its own whispered legend. Hemlock Hall, however, seemed to be the undisputed champion of campus ghost lore. And room number 413? Apparently, it was the VIP suite of the spectral residence. It began subtly. During orientation week, an overly cheerful resident advisor, handing out welcome packets, leaned in conspiratorially after noticing my room number. "Oh, 413, she chirped, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Got yourself the famous one." "Don't worry, it's probably just old pipes." "Famous for what?" "Old pipes causing what?" Her vague reassurance did the opposite of reassuring. Later, chatter in the dining hall, snippets overheard between bites of mediocre pizza. "Yeah, my cousin's friend lived in Hemlock, said weird stuff happened all the time." Someone told me a girl died in one of the rooms on the fourth floor, like ages ago. The details were always fuzzy, third-hand accounts shifting like smoke, but the theme was consistent. Hemlock Hall, particularly the fourth floor, particularly room number 413, was not right. My roommate, Chloe, finally arrived a day later, a bubbly, energetic girl who immediately started plastering our walls with band posters. She heard the rumors too, relaying them with wide-eyed fascination rather than fear. They say, she whispered dramatically one evening, perched on her bed, that a student back in the 70s, well, she had a breakdown. Right here. In this room. Some say she vanished, others say, worse. Worse was left hanging in the air, undefined but heavy. People have heard things, she continued. Whispering, crying, footsteps when no one's there. And sometimes, things go missing. Small things. Then they turn up in weird places. I laughed it off. Honestly, I did. I've always been the pragmatic one, the skeptic. Ghosts? Whispers in the dark? Please. Old buildings creak. Drafts happen. Stress and lack of sleep, staples of college life, can make your mind play tricks on you. Missing keys probably just meant someone was forgetful. Every story had a logical explanation, a mundane route obscured by years of embellished retelling. Sounds like classic college folklore, I told Chloe, shrugging. Every campus needs a ghost story to freak out the freshmen. It's practically tradition. I made jokes about charging our ghost rent, asking if it preferred indie rock or pop punk, based on Chloe's poster choices. For the first few weeks, my skepticism felt entirely justified. Life fell into a rhythm. Classes, studying, navigating the labyrinthine campus, late-night talks with Chloe, the occasional party. Room number 413 remained stubbornly normal. The pipes gurgled sometimes, sure. The heating was temperamental, occasionally leaving one side of the room noticeably colder than the other. The floorboards in the hallway outside sometimes creaked under phantom weight. But it was an old building. Of course it made noise. Of course it had cold spots. I explained away every little oddity, reinforcing my own rational worldview. The ghost stories became a running joke between Chloe and me. We'd blame the hemlock haunter if one of us misplaced our phone charger or if the ancient radiator clanked too loudly. It was funny. Harmless. I prided myself on not being spooked. While others might jump at shadows or whisper nervously about the legends, I slept soundly, secure in my belief that the only horrors in Hemlock Hall were the communal bathrooms and the price of textbooks. The stories were just stories, woven from loneliness, homesickness, and the overactive imaginations of stressed-out students needing a distraction. Nothing more. How wrong I was. How terrifyingly, utterly wrong. The universe, it seems, has a particularly nasty way of shattering smug certainty. My dismissal, my jokes, my rationalizations, they were all just defenses waiting to be breached. The foundations of my comfortable reality were about to be shaken, not by a gradual accumulation of eerie events, but by a sudden, paralyzing plunge into inexplicable terror. It happened about a month into the semester. Midterms were looming, stress levels were high, and sleep was becoming a precious, rationed commodity. I'd pulled a near all-nighter studying for a particularly brutal history exam, finally crawling into bed well after 2 a.m. Chloe was already asleep, her breathing soft and even across the room. The dorm was quiet, wrapped in that deep, muffling silence that only falls in the dead of night. Exhaustion pulled at me like a physical weight. I remember thinking, just before drifting off, how mundane it all was. Just another night in a boring dorm room. No ghosts, no whispers, just the promise of a few hours of oblivion before the morning alarm. I closed my eyes, oblivious, unprepared, completely and foolishly unaware of the icy presence waiting in the darkness beside me. Sleep claimed me quickly, but it wasn't the restful escape I craved. It was merely the doorway through which the real horror of room number 413 was about to step. It wasn't a gradual awakening. There was no gentle transition from the depths of sleep to hazy consciousness. One moment, I was lost in the heavy, dreamless void of exhaustion. The next, my eyes snapped open to the near-pitch blackness of the dorm room, my mind instantly, terrifyingly alert. But that was all that responded. My body remained utterly, horrifyingly still. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me. I tried to sit up, to gasp, to even twitch a finger, but nothing happened. It was like my brain was disconnected from the rest of me, screaming commands into a void where the wires had been cut. My limbs felt like lead weights, impossibly heavy, fused to the mattress. My chest was tight, breathing shallow and rapid, the only physical response I seemed capable of. I couldn't turn my head, couldn't make a sound. My eyes darted wildly in their sockets, frantically scanning the familiar shadows of the room, the looming shape of the wardrobe, the faint rectangle of the window, the silhouette of Chloe's sleeping form across the room, searching for a source, an explanation, anything. Sleep paralysis. The rational part of my brain, small and trembling but still functional, supplied the term. I'd read about it, a temporary inability to move or speak while falling asleep or waking up, often accompanied by hallucinations. Stress and sleep deprivation were known triggers. Okay, Izzy, okay, I told myself, clinging to the explanation like a life raft. It's just sleep paralysis. Stress from midterms. You pulled an all-nighter. It's scary, but it's natural. It will pass. But the explanation felt thin, flimsy, wholly inadequate in the face of the sheer, primal terror gripping me. This wasn't just immobility. This felt imposed, malign. And then I felt it. Beside me. On the empty side of my twin bed, where there should have been nothing but slightly rumpled sheets, there was a patch of intense, unnatural cold. It wasn't just a draft from the notoriously fickle Hemlock Hall heating system. This was a focused, penetrating chill, radiating outwards like a block of dry ice had been placed directly onto the mattress. It seeped through the thin blanket, through my pajamas, leaching the warmth from my skin, raising goosebumps despite my paralysis. My eyes, still locked forward, couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, its distinct shape, roughly the size and impression of a person lying curled on their side, facing away from me. The cold wasn't static. It seemed to pulse, faintly, intensifying the terrifying intimacy of its proximity. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. It's not real. Hallucination. Sleep paralysis, my mind chanted, a desperate mantra losing its power with every icy wave that washed over my side. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. And then came the laughter. It started almost imperceptibly, a faint, sibilant whisper right next to my ear. So close I could almost feel the phantom puff of breath against my skin, though there was no warmth to it, only that same pervading cold. At first, I thought I was imagining it, my overtired brain manufacturing sounds in the dark. But it grew, slowly, steadily, coalescing from a vague hiss into distinct, soft chuckles. It wasn't human laughter. There was no warmth, no mirth, no joy in the sound. It was thin, dry, and brittle, like rustling dead leaves or the skittering of insects in a wall cavity. It held an undercurrent of cruel amusement, a mocking delight that seemed directed solely at my terror, my helplessness. It whispered and giggled, a private joke shared between the unseen presence and the suffocating darkness, with me as the unwilling, paralyzed audience. Ha, ha, ha. The sound scraped along my nerves, bypassing my ears and resonating deep within my skull. Every instinct screamed at me to recoil, to lash out, to scream Chloe's name, but I was trapped, a prisoner in my own body, forced to endure the icy presence beside me and the chilling, intimate mockery whispered directly into my ear. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, blurring the shadows into meaningless shapes, but they couldn't fall. Even crying was a physical act denied to me. Time lost all meaning. Seconds stretched into agonizing eternities. Was it minutes? An hour? The cold patch remained, a constant, chilling pressure against my side. The whispering laughter continued, sometimes fading slightly, only to return with renewed, mocking intensity, as if savoring my fear. My rationalizations crumbled completely. This wasn't sleep paralysis. Not like anything I'd ever read about. The sheer physicality of the cold, the undeniable proximity of the laughter, it felt utterly, terrifyingly real. The ghost stories, the legends of room number 413 I had so casually dismissed, flooded back into my mind, no longer amusing anecdotes but horrifying possibilities. The girl who had a breakdown. The whispers. The feeling of being watched. It wasn't just folklore. It was here. Lying next to me. Laughing at me. My frantic gaze flickered again towards Chloe's bed. She hadn't moved. Her breathing remained slow and even, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just a few feet away. A desperate sense of isolation washed over me, colder even than the patch on the bed. I was utterly alone with this thing. Just when I thought the terror would literally stop my heart, just when the last vestiges of my sanity felt like they were fraying, it stopped. Abruptly. The laughter ceased mid-chuckle, cutting off into absolute silence. Simultaneously, the intense cold beside me dissipated, not gradually, but instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. And just like that, I could move. With a choked gasp that ripped through my throat, I lurched upright, scrambling backwards against the headboard, pulling my knees to my chest. My breath came in ragged, painful sobs. My whole body trembled violently, an uncontrollable reaction to the adrenaline dump and the release from paralysis. My eyes scanned the bed beside me, white with terror. There was nothing there. The sheets were slightly indented, perhaps from my own thrashing attempts to move earlier, but there was no lingering cold, no visible presence. Just an empty space on the bed. I reached out a shaking hand, palm hovering over the spot where the icy patch had been. Normal temperature. Cool dorm room air, nothing more. But the feeling lingered. The memory of that penetrating chill. The echo of that dry, whispering laughter burned into my brain. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. I knew it with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. I sat there, huddled against the headboard, shaking and gasping in the dark for what felt like hours, watching the empty space beside me, listening to the silence that now felt heavy, pregnant, waiting. The first gray hints of dawn began to creep through the window, diluting the oppressive darkness, but offering little comfort. My skepticism, my carefully constructed rational world, lay in ruins around me. The jokes were over. Hemlock Hall number 413 wasn't just a room with old pipes and creepy stories. It was haunted. And whatever resided there knew I was awake. It had touched me. It had laughed at me. And I had the sickening feeling that this was only the beginning. Dawn broke fully, painting the sky in pale, in different shades of gray and pink, but the light offered no sanctuary. It merely illuminated the scene of my terror, making the ordinary objects in the room, the desks, the posters, Chloe still sleeping peacefully, seem alien and menacing in their normalcy. The memory of the icy cold and the dry, whispering laughter was branded onto my mind, a visceral horror that refused to fade with the darkness. Sleep was impossible now. Every creak of the old building, every sigh of the wind outside the window, sent jolts of adrenaline through me. I remained huddled against the headboard, eyes wide, scanning the empty air beside my bed, convinced that the moment I relaxed, the moment I dared to believe it was over, it would return. When Chloe finally stirred, stretching and yawning, completely oblivious, I almost burst into tears of relief and renewed fear. How could she not know? How could she not feel the wrongness that now saturated the very air of room number 413? I watched her go through her morning routine, brushing her teeth at our shared sink, humming tunelessly, complaining about an early class, and the sheer normality of it felt like a scene from another lifetime. My own reality had fractured during the night, leaving me stranded on the terrifying side of the divide. Should I tell her? The question hammered at me. Part of me desperately wanted to pour it all out, to share the burden of the terror, to have someone validate my experience. But the skeptic I used to be, though battered and bruised, whispered doubts. She'll think you're crazy. She'll say it was a nightmare, sleep paralysis, just like you tried to tell yourself. The ghost stories had been a fun, spooky diversion for her. Would she believe they were real, especially when the horror had focused solely on me? What if telling her somehow made it worse? What if the entity, because I couldn't deny it was an entity now, took offense? I opted for a shaky middle ground. Hey, Chloe. I started, my voice hoarse and trembling slightly. Did you hear anything weird last night? Or feel anything? She paused, mid-eyeliner application. Weird? Like what? Old Man Hemlock's pipes groaning again? She laughed, a light, easy sound that felt like a physical blow. Nah, I slept like a log. Totally crashed after that study session. Why? Did the haunter pay you a visit? She winked, turning back to the mirror. My stomach plummeted. The casual dismissal, the joking reference to the haunter, it solidified my isolation. No, I mumbled, forcing a weak smile. No, just thought I heard something. Must have been dreaming. The lie felt heavy and sour in my mouth. But denying it didn't make it go away. The experience lingered, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of everyday college life. I threw myself into my studies with a desperate fervor, hoping exhaustion and distraction would keep the nights quiet. I avoided being alone in the room whenever possible, studying in the library until it closed, lingering in the common areas, delaying the inevitable return to number 413 for as long as I could each evening. Sleep became a dreaded necessity, approached with trepidation. I started leaving the small desk lamp on, casting long, dancing shadows that were almost as unnerving as the pitch blackness, but somehow felt marginally safer. The entity didn't manifest with the same intensity as that first night, not immediately. Instead, it seemed to toy with me, its presence felt in subtle, insidious ways. Objects would be slightly out of place, a textbook moved from the desk to the floor, a pen missing only to reappear under my pillow, the closet door left ajar when I knew I had closed it. Small things, easily dismissible on their own, but accumulating into a pattern of quiet, deliberate manipulation. Plausible deniability. Was it Chloe being messy? Was it my own stressed-out forgetfulness? Or was it reminding me it was still there, watching, waiting? The cold spots became more frequent, no longer confined to my bed. Sometimes, sitting at my desk, an icy patch would bloom on the wall beside me, radiating a chill that made my teeth chatter before vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The air would occasionally grow heavy and still, thick with a palpable sense of being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling for no discernible reason. And the sounds. Not the overt laughter from that first night, but fainter, more ambiguous noises. Soft whispers that seemed to come from the corners of the room, always too indistinct to make out any words, vanishing the moment I turned my head. A faint scratching sound from inside the walls, like fingernails dragging across drywall. Footsteps in the hallway outside our door late at night, pausing right outside, followed by silence when I held my breath to listen. Chloe never seemed to notice, or if she did, she dismissed them as the building's usual quirks. My attempts to point them out were met with shrugs or reassurances that it was just the wind or students in the hallway. My fear was isolating me further, making me feel like I was losing my grip. My grades started to slip. Concentration became difficult, my mind constantly drifting back to the fear, analyzing every creak and shadow. Friends commented that I looked tired, jumpy. I forced smiles, made excuses about midterms, but the carefully constructed facade of the pragmatic, unfazed Izzy was crumbling fast. The lack of sleep gnawed at me, leaving me perpetually exhausted and on edge. The room itself began to feel oppressive, the beige walls closing in, the air thick with unspoken menace. The breaking point came about 2 weeks after the paralysis incident. It was another late night. Chloe was out with friends, and I was alone, trying desperately to focus on an essay. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. The only sounds were the tapping of my keyboard and the frantic thumping of my own heart. Suddenly, the desk lamp flickered violently. Once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the glow of my laptop screen. Annoyance warred with immediate fear. Just the bulb, I told myself, reaching for the lamp switch. Or faulty wiring in this ancient building. But as my fingers brushed the switch, a sound emanated from the corner of the room, near the wardrobe. A distinct, drawn-out sigh. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the pipes. It was the sound of breath being released, slow, deliberate, and filled with an ancient weariness, yet somehow menacing. It was undeniably inside the room with me. I froze, hand hovering over the lamp, every muscle tensed. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by my own ragged breathing. My eyes strained against the darkness, trying to pierce the shadows in the corner. Nothing. Just the dark shape of the wardrobe. Then, softly, from that same corner, came a whisper. Clearer this time. Not laughter, not a sigh, but a single, chilling word that slid into the silence like ice down my spine. Izzy. It knew my name. My nickname. That was it. Rationalization shattered. Denial evaporated. This wasn't random phenomena. This was personal. It knew me. It was addressing me. I didn't scream. I didn't move. Pure, unadulterated terror held me captive, more effectively than any sleep paralysis. I sat there, bathed in the cold glow of the laptop screen, staring into the oppressive darkness of the corner, waiting for whatever came next. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with anticipation. It didn't speak again, didn't sigh, didn't move anything. It just let its presence, its knowledge of me, hang in the air. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear. Eventually, the need to escape, to get out, overwhelmed the paralysis. With a strangled sob, I bolted from the chair, fumbled for the door handle, wrenched it open, and stumbled out into the brightly lit hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the crowded common room downstairs, collapsing onto a worn sofa, shaking uncontrollably, surrounded by the noise and light of other students who had no idea I had just fled from a darkness that knew my name. I couldn't go back. Not alone. Not tonight. But the chilling realization settled deep in my bones. Leaving the room offered only temporary respite. My name was Isabella, Izzy for short. And whatever haunted Hemlock Hall number 413, whatever whispered my name in the dark, wasn't finished with me yet. The true Dark Night horror stories weren't just stories anymore. I was living in one. And I had no idea how it would end. My name's Mason. Most folks I know are winding down by 10 p.m., maybe catching a late show or getting ready for bed. Me? That's usually when my workday is just getting started. I pull the overnight shift doing security at the city's historical museum. Sounds pretty tame, maybe even a little prestigious if you squint right, but mostly, it's quiet. Dead quiet. That's the main perk, and sometimes, the main problem. You get a lot of time alone with your thoughts in a place like this, surrounded by things that have seen more history than you could read in a lifetime. The building itself is old, a grand stone structure with high ceilings, echoing marble floors, and the kind of deep, settled silence that only decades upon decades can create. During the day, it buzzes with school groups, tourists, the hushed whispers of people looking at exhibits. But at night, it's a different beast altogether. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows that make familiar shapes seem alien. The portraits on the walls? Their eyes seem to follow you as you walk past with your flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The clicks of my boots on the polished stone, the jingle of keys on my belt loop, the occasional hum of the ancient HVAC system kicking in, those are usually the loudest things you hear for 8 solid hours. It's peaceful, in a way. Isolated. You feel like the last man on Earth sometimes, walking these deserted halls filled with the ghosts of the past. Figuratively speaking, of course. At least, that's what I always told myself. My rounds are pretty standard. Check the main entrances, make sure all gallery doors are secure, walk the perimeter of each floor, punch a clock key at designated points. The Egyptian exhibit is always a bit creepy, even during the day. Those sarcophagi look unnervingly like they're just waiting for someone to turn their back. The dinosaur hall feels vast and skeletal, the shadows making the T-Rex look like it might just take a step off its platform. But usually, the wing that feels the most heavy is the Civil War exhibit. It's on the second floor, tucked away in the West Wing. It's not one of the flashier exhibits. No giant dinosaur bones or glittering pharaoh masks. It's somber. Glass cases filled with tarnished belt buckles, faded letters written in looping cursive, mini balls dug out of battlefields, stiff old uniforms on faceless mannequins that seem frozen mid-stride, and photographs of young men staring out with impossibly old eyes. There's a weight in that room, a sense of profound sadness that clings to the air like the faint smell of dust and old paper. Even on a bright afternoon, it feels dimly lit, hushed. At night, it's downright oppressive. The darkness seems thicker in there, swallowing the beam of my flashlight faster than anywhere else in the museum. So, last week, Tuesday night, I think. Or maybe Wednesday. The nights tend to blur together on this shift. It was raining outside, one of those steady, drumming rains that makes the isolation feel even more complete. I was doing my 2 a.m. round. Everything was normal. Checked the doors, scanned the galleries on the first floor. Headed up the grand staircase, the only sound my own footsteps and the distant drumming of rain on the roof. I reached the second floor, checked the Renaissance art section, the local history display, and then made my way towards the West Wing, towards the Civil War exhibit. As I approached the entrance archway, pushing through the heavy oak door that always groaned like an old man getting out of bed, I stopped. Faintly, so faintly I thought I might be imagining it, I heard music. It was a thin, reedy sound. A fife. Playing a simple, almost mournful tune. It wasn't coming from the hallway I was in, but from inside the exhibit hall. From the far end, near the display about field musicians. My first thought was, well, confusion. There's no audio system in that wing. None at all. It's one of the oldest parts of the museum, and the budget never stretched to wiring it for sound or interactive displays. It's all static exhibits, artifacts under glass, and information placards. No speakers, no hidden projectors, nothing. I strained my ears. The rain was still drumming, but underneath it, yes, there it was again. A fife. Playing softly, intermittently, like someone was practicing, or maybe just remembering a tune. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. The only answer was the echo of my own voice bouncing off the far walls. The music stopped. Silence flooded back in, heavy and absolute, broken only by the rain. Okay, weird. Maybe it was the wind? An odd draft whistling through a vent or a crack somewhere, creating a flute-like sound? Possible, I guess. Old buildings make strange noises. Or maybe it was sound carrying from somewhere else entirely. From outside? But the windows in that wing are sealed shut, thick old glass, and the rain was making enough noise to drown out most distant sounds. And it had sounded so close, so distinctly like a fife, coming from right down the hall. I took a breath, gripped my flashlight a little tighter, and stepped fully into the exhibit hall. My beam swept across the displays. Mannequins in blue and gray stood silent sentinel. Glass cases reflected the light back at me. Everything was still, exactly as it should be. I started walking slowly down the central aisle, my boots soft on the worn wooden floorboards in this section. The air was cool and still. I scanned every corner, peered behind the larger displays, shone my light up towards the high ceiling. Nothing. I reached the far end, where the display about fifers and drummers was located. There was a glass case containing a dented brass drum, cracked leather straps hanging loose. Next to it, another case held a simple wooden fife, dark with age, resting on a bed of faded velvet. It looked inert, ancient. Behind the cases, more mannequins, one posed as if holding a fife to its lips, though its hands were empty wood. Nothing else. No hidden speaker, no open vent nearby, no sign of anything that could have made that sound. I stood there for a long moment, just listening. Only the rain. My own breathing sounded loud now. I felt uneasy. Not scared, exactly, but deeply unsettled. It's one thing to deal with the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling. It's another thing entirely to hear something as specific and out of place as a fife playing in a sealed, silent room with no explanation. I forced myself to rationalize. Acoustics are weird. Maybe the sound had come from outside, bouncing strangely through the ventilation shafts, even if I couldn't hear it clearly from the hallway. Maybe I was just tired, the graveyard shift playing tricks on my ears. Yeah, that had to be it. Just tired. But as I continued my rounds, walking away from the Civil War exhibit and back into the main, marble-floored sections of the museum, I couldn't shake the feeling. The silence of the museum didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watchful. And every so often, I thought I could almost hear it, just at the edge of my hearing, the faint, ghostly echo of a fife. I spent the rest of that shift feeling like I wasn't quite alone in the vast, dark building, the weight of history feeling heavier, and somehow more present than ever before. The memory of that thin, lonely music lingered long after the sun came up. The next few nights were tense. I'd be lying if I said the fife incident didn't get under my skin. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the old building settling, every distant siren wail seemed amplified, carrying a potential threat it never had before. I tried to laugh it off during the daylight hours, telling myself it was fatigue, the rain, an overactive imagination fueled by too many late nights surrounded by relics of the dead. But when the sun went down and the heavy museum doors clicked shut behind the last staff member, leaving me alone in the echoing silence, the memory of that thin, reedy music returned. Especially when my rounds took me towards the second floor, towards the west wing. I found myself delaying that part of my patrol. Taking a little longer checking the ground floor exhibits, lingering by the windows overlooking the now quiet city streets, double-checking locks that I knew were secure. It wasn't conscious, not at first, but I realized I was subconsciously putting off the walk towards the Civil War exhibit. The thought of hearing that fife again, faint and ghostly in the oppressive darkness, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the building's nighttime temperature. When I finally couldn't delay it any longer, usually around the 1:30 a.m. or 2 a.m. mark, I'd approach the West Wing with a sense of dread I hadn't felt since I was a kid, daring myself to walk past a supposedly haunted house. My flashlight beam felt inadequate, pushing back the shadows but never quite dispelling the feeling of being watched. The air always seemed colder as I got closer, the silence deeper, more profound. Pushing open the heavy oak door to the exhibit still produced that groan, but now it sounded less like an old man and more like a warning. I'd step inside, sweeping my light across the familiar scene, the impassive mannequins in their blue and gray uniforms, the glint of light on glass display cases, the somber photographs staring out from the walls. And I would listen. Listen with an intensity that strained my ears, waiting for that phantom melody to start up again. But it didn't. Night after night, the Civil War exhibit remained silent. Utterly, unnervingly silent. The absence of the sound was almost as unsettling as hearing it had been. It made me question my own sanity again. Had I really heard it? Or had the combination of rain, isolation, and the inherent creepiness of the place just conjured it from my tired mind? Yet, other things started to happen. Small things. Things easily dismissed on their own, but taken together, they began to weave a pattern of wrongness. One night, as I was walking down the main aisle of the exhibit, I heard a distinct scuffing sound behind me. Like a boot heel dragging slightly on the wooden floor. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just a row of mannequins, frozen in their historical tableau. I checked the floor, no debris, nothing I could have kicked, nothing that could have fallen. I told myself it was a rat, maybe, or the building settling. But it had sounded so close, so deliberate. Another night, I was standing near the display case containing the letters home, faded pages filled with soldiers' hopes and fears. My flashlight beam was steady on the case, illuminating the careful script. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement further down the hall, near the entrance. A flicker of shadow, low to the ground, like something darting quickly out of sight. Again, I swung the light, heart pounding. Again, nothing. Just the empty archway leading back out into the main corridor. A trick of the light? A shadow cast by my own movement? Probably. Almost certainly. But the feeling of not being alone intensified. I started paying closer attention to the details. Were the mannequins exactly where they were supposed to be? It's hard to tell for sure. You see the same things night after night, and your memory can play tricks. But sometimes, the angle of a head seems slightly different. The position of a stiff, wool-clad arm seemed minutely adjusted. Was the Pfeiffer mannequin's head tilted a fraction more towards me tonight than it was last night? Impossible to say for sure. Easy to dismiss. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my rational mind. The most concrete thing happened towards the end of the week. I was nearing the end of my rounds in the exhibit, standing once again before the display case holding the old wooden fife. I shone my light on it, just like I did every night now, half expecting it to start playing on its own. It sat there, inert on its velvet bed. But as my light lingered, I noticed something. On the dusty glass of the case, right near the fife, there was a smudge. A small, distinct smudge on the inside of the glass. It looked almost like a thumbprint. My blood ran cold. These cases hadn't been opened in years, not according to the museum records I discreetly checked after the first incident, under the guise of reviewing cleaning schedules. They were sealed for preservation. The curators were meticulous. No one went into these cases without extensive paperwork and specific reasons. Certainly not overnight. And definitely not leaving smudges on the inside. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the exterior glass. It was faint, but it was undeniably there. A greasy whirl against the clean interior surface, right where someone might press their thumb if they were holding the fife. Or perhaps putting it back down? My carefully constructed rationalizations, the wind, fatigue, acoustics, tricks of the light, crumbled. A sound could be imagined. A shadow could be misinterpreted. But a fingerprint on the inside of a sealed display case? That was physical. That was real. I backed away slowly, my flashlight beam trembling slightly. The silence of the room pressed in on me, no longer empty but charged, expectant. The mannequins seemed to loom larger in the darkness, their faceless heads turned slightly towards the case, towards the smudge, towards me. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken history and something else, something watchful and ancient and not entirely gone. The fife remained silent in its case, but I had the sudden, terrifying certainty that it hadn't been silent all along. Someone, or something, had been here. And the smudge on the glass felt less like a clue, and more like a message. Or maybe, a territorial marking. I finished my rounds that night with my hand hovering near my radio, glancing over my shoulder at every corner, the silence now screaming louder than any phantom music ever could. The museum didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. Reporting the smudge felt ridiculous. Who was I going to tell? My supervisor, Dave? A portly guy nearing retirement who mostly cared about whether the coffee machine was working and if I clocked in on time? Hey Dave, I think a ghost left a fingerprint inside a sealed Civil War display case after playing a Phantom Fife. Yeah, right. I could practically hear his dismissive chuckle already. Or the police. They'd laugh me out of the building. No, reporting it wasn't an option. I wiped the outside of the glass clean where my breath had fogged it, leaving the faint, ghostly whirl undisturbed on the inside, a silent testament to something. I was on my own with this. Sleep became difficult. During the day, the memory of that smudge, the scuffing sound, the fleeting shadow, and the Phantom Fife music would replay in my mind. Every shadow in my apartment seemed a little too deep. Every creak of my own floorboards made me jump. I started drinking more coffee before my shifts, hoping the caffeine would keep me sharp, but it mostly just frayed my nerves further. Walking into the museum each night now felt like stepping into enemy territory. The familiar marble halls seemed colder, the portrait's eyes more accusatory, the silence more suffocating. My rounds in the Civil War exhibit became exercises in controlled terror. I forced myself to do them, to walk the perimeter, check the corners, punch the key. But I did it faster now, my flashlight beam constantly flicking back and forth, my ears straining for any sound over the frantic pounding of my own heart. The feeling of being watched was no longer subtle. It was a palpable pressure on the back of my neck, a prickling sensation across my skin. It felt concentrated near the mannequins. Those damn mannequins. Faceless, lifeless figures clad in the uniforms of men long dead. Before, they were just part of the scenery. Now, they felt like the main audience. I started avoiding looking directly at them, instead using peripheral vision, catching glimpses of their stiff postures as I swept my light past. Because when I did look directly, sometimes I wasn't sure if they were exactly where they'd been moments before. One night, I was checking the display case with the tarnished belt buckles. I distinctly remember the mannequin nearest to it, a Union soldier, posed as if loading a rifle, was facing slightly towards the center of the aisle. I turned my back for maybe 10 seconds to examine the lock on a nearby emergency exit. When I turned back, the mannequin's head was angled directly towards me. Its blank, featureless face seemed to be staring right into my soul. My breath hitched. I shone the light directly on it. It was perfectly still. Had it always been facing that way? Was my tired, paranoid mind just manufacturing these shifts? I couldn't be sure. But the fear was cold and real in my gut. Then came the fife music again. It wasn't like the first time, faint and distant. This time, it started abruptly while I was in the middle of the exhibit hall. Clear as day, sharp and piercing, the same mournful tune, but louder now. And it wasn't coming from the far end of the hall. It sounded like it was coming from right behind me. I whipped around, flashlight held like a weapon. The sound stopped instantly. Silence crashed back in. Behind me was the display of Confederate uniforms, the mannequins standing stoically. Nothing else. No source for the music. My hands were shaking now. This wasn't acoustics. This wasn't the wind. This was in the room with me. Who's there? I yelled, my voice cracking. Show yourself. Only silence answered. But the air felt thick, charged with static electricity. And the mannequins. I swear, the one representing the Pfeiffer boy, the one near the case with the smudge, its head was tilted slightly, as if listening. Its empty wooden hands seemed poised, as if it had just lowered the instrument. I started backing away towards the entrance, flashlight beam dancing nervously across the figures. They stood frozen, yet they seemed intensely alive, watchful. Their collective, sightless gaze felt like a physical weight. As I reached the heavy oak door, my hand fumbling for the handle, I heard one final sound. Not music this time. A single, soft, drawn-out sigh, like air escaping old lungs. It seemed to come from the center of the room, from the midst of the silent, uniformed figures. I didn't wait. I yanked the door open and practically fell out into the main corridor, slamming the door shut behind me. The groan it made echoed down the empty hall. I leaned against the cool marble wall, gasping for breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I finished the rest of my shift in the main security office, watching the monitors, jumping at every flicker of static. I didn't do any more rounds on the second floor that night. The smudge, the sounds, the movement, it all pointed to something deeply wrong in that exhibit, something tied to the artifacts, to the history, to the silent figures standing guard over it. I don't know what's in that room. A ghost? The residual energy of the soldiers who wore those uniforms, who held that fife. Maybe something drawn to the sadness and violence represented there? All I know is that it's not empty. It's occupied, just like I felt before. And it's aware. It knows I'm there. I put in my 2 weeks' notice the next morning. Dave just grunted, probably figured I couldn't handle the late hours. I didn't try to explain. How could I? Some nights, when the wind whistles just right, I think I can almost hear a faint, reedy tune carried on the breeze. And I never, ever visit the City Historical Museum anymore. Some history is better left undisturbed, locked away in the dark with its watchful guardians. Let someone else walk those halls at night. Let someone else listen to the silence. I've heard enough.